The Imperium of man, for all its vastness and 10 millennia of existence, had never encountered anything like what emerged from the intergalactic void. The first recorded contact came in 745 of the 41st millennium, when all communication ceased from the mining and agricultural worlds of the Tyranid system in the eastern fringe. The initial response followed standard protocol. A detachment of the Ultramarines chapter was dispatched to investigate what Imperial authorities presumed to be either a localized rebellion or perhaps an orc incursion. What the Ultramarines found defied all previous Xenos classifications. The Tyranid system had been completely stripped of life. Every world, every moon, every orbital station had been reduced to barren rock. The oceans had been drained and consumed. The atmosphere itself had been partially devoured, leaving toxic remnants that could no longer support any form of biological existence. Most disturbing were the cities. Structures remained largely intact, but every scrap of organic matter had vanished. Bodies, clothing, food stores, even wooden furniture, and the bacteria in the water treatment facilities, all gone. The population of billions had simply ceased to exist, their biomass harvested down to the molecular level. The Ultramarines encountered the creatures responsible during their investigation of Tyranid Primus. The initial engagement was brief and catastrophic. Swarms of creatures that seemed purpose-bred for killing descended upon the Space Marines with a coordination that suggested a single directing intelligence. Some organisms were small, scuttling horrors with blade-like limbs that could tear through ceramite given enough time and numbers. Others were massive, towering monstrosities that combined the durability of battle tanks with biological weapon systems that spat corrosive fluids and razor-sharp projectiles grown within their own bodies. The Ultramarines fought their way back to their strike cruiser, but not before losing nearly half their number. They transmitted his findings back to Macragge before his ship was overwhelmed by a living asteroid, a massive bioship that had somehow approached without triggering standard auger arrays. The Imperium designated these creatures Tyranids, after the doomed system where they were first encountered. The name would soon become synonymous with existential dread throughout the eastern fringe and beyond. Initial xenobiological analysis of recovered specimens revealed organisms that defied conventional understanding of evolution. Each creature appeared specifically designed for its role, with redundant biological systems and adaptive capabilities that suggested deliberate engineering rather than natural selection. Their genetic structure incorporated elements that Imperial Magos biologists had never seen in any known life form, including sequences that seemed to exist solely to facilitate rapid mutation and adaptation. The true horror of the Tyranid threat, however, lay not in their individual organisms, but in the force that bound them together. The hive mind represents a gestalt psychic consciousness of such magnitude that it dwarfs even the most powerful psykers humanity has ever produced. Every Tyranid organism, from the smallest ripper to the largest biotitan, exists as a neuron within this vast psychic network. They possess no individual consciousness, no sense of self-preservation, no fear or hesitation. Each creature functions as a living weapon directed by an intelligence that spans light years and coordinates trillions of organisms with perfect synchronization. The hive mind's presence in the warp is unlike anything else encountered by Imperial psykers. It manifests as an overwhelming psychic pressure that navigator houses describe as the shadow in the warp, a smothering darkness that blocks out the astronomican's light and makes warp travel near Tyranid fleets extremely hazardous. Astropaths attempting to send messages through regions infested with Tyranids report experiencing a psychic scream, a hunger so vast and alien that many go mad from momentary contact. This shadow effect extends for dozens of light years around major Hive Fleet concentrations, effectively blinding the Imperium to their movements and preventing calls for reinforcement from reaching Imperial command. The synaptic network that enables the hive mind functions through specialized Tyranid organisms. Synapse creatures, including Tyranid warriors, Tyranid primes, and the massive hive tyrants, serve as psychic relay nodes, extending the hive mind's direct control to the swarms around them. Lesser organisms within range of these synapse creatures fight with perfect coordination, responding to threats and opportunities with inhuman precision. When synapse creatures are eliminated, the lesser Tyranids in their vicinity often revert to base instincts, becoming disorganized and easier to defeat. However, the hive mind learns from every engagement, and subsequent attacks account for previous tactical weaknesses. The strategic adaptation capabilities of the hive mind present perhaps the greatest long-term threat. Every Tyranid organism that dies in battle has its experiences absorbed back into the collective consciousness through the synaptic network. The hive mind remembers every weapon used against it, every defensive strategy employed, every weakness exploited. Worlds that successfully repel initial Tyranid assaults invariably face subsequent waves specifically adapted to counter their defenses. Regiments that rely on plasma weapons find themselves facing Tyranids with heat-resistant carapaces. Fortress worlds with extensive underground bunker networks are invaded by burrowing organisms that can navigate through solid rock. The Tyranids do not simply attack, they learn, adapt, and return stronger. The origins of the Tyranid hive fleets remain shrouded in mystery, though the evidence suggests a journey of unimaginable duration and scale. Observations by Adeptus Mechanicus explorator fleets and analysis of Tyranid approach vectors indicate that the major hive fleets arrived in the galaxy from below the galactic plane, suggesting an intergalactic origin. The distances involved stagger comprehension. Even at relativistic speeds, the journey from the nearest galaxy would require millions of years. The Tyranids appear to have spent this time in the void between galaxies, drifting through absolute darkness in a state of hibernation until their bioships detected the psychic beacon of life in the Milky Way. The consumption pattern observed in the wake of Tyranid hive fleets provides insight into their nature as an intergalactic predator. Every world touched by the Tyranids undergoes the same systematic harvesting. First, the hive fleet establishes orbital superiority through sheer numbers, their bioships blocking out the sun and raining spores onto the surface. These spores rapidly grow into towering structures, capillary towers that begin converting the planet's atmosphere into a toxic soup that kills most native life while nourishing Tyranid organisms. Digestion pools form where biomass is liquefied and prepared for consumption. Ripper swarms, small but voracious creatures, spread across the planet's surface like a living carpet, devouring everything organic. The oceans are drained, forests consumed, even microbial life in the soil is harvested. When the Tyranids finally depart, they leave behind a dead rock stripped of everything that could sustain life, its resources converted entirely into more Tyranids. The Magos biologists of the Adeptus Mechanicus have proposed numerous theories regarding Tyranid origins, though none can be confirmed. Some xenobiologists suggest the Tyranids were created as bioweapons by an ancient civilization, perhaps designed to fight some long-extinct threat. The level of biological engineering evident in Tyranid organisms certainly supports artificial creation. No known evolutionary process could produce such perfectly specialized organisms across such a vast range of roles and capabilities. The counter-argument notes that any civilization capable of creating the Tyranids would likely have been consumed by their own creation, a fate that may explain why no trace of such progenitors has ever been discovered. Alternative theories propose that the Tyranids evolved naturally in the void between galaxies, adapting to survive in an environment utterly hostile to conventional life. This hypothesis suggests that the Tyranids developed their ability to hibernate for millions of years as a survival mechanism, drifting through the intergalactic void until encountering sources of biomass. Their arrival in the Milky Way would then represent the first time in potentially millions of years that they encountered sufficient resources to fuel exponential reproduction. The consumption of entire worlds would not be malicious, but simply the feeding behavior of a species that evolved in an environment of extreme scarcity. The most disturbing theory, whispered among certain radical members of the Ordo Xenos, suggests that the Tyranids have done this before. This hypothesis proposes that the hive fleets consumed an entire galaxy before arriving at the Milky Way, stripping it of all biomass and leaving behind nothing but lifeless stars and dead worlds. Under this model, the Tyranids represent a galactic-scale extinction event, a force of nature that moves from galaxy to galaxy, consuming all life and growing ever larger. The implications of this theory are so catastrophic that most Imperial authorities refuse to seriously consider it. If true, the Tyranids attacking the Imperium represent only the vanguard of a force that has already consumed biomass equivalent to trillions of worlds. Genetic analysis of Tyranid specimens has revealed evidence supporting elements of multiple origin theories. The Tyranid genome contains biological information from thousands of different species, many of which do not match any known life form in the Milky Way. This suggests that the Tyranids have been consuming and incorporating genetic material from multiple sources for an extended period. Each new species consumed adds to the Tyranid genetic library, providing templates for future adaptations. The hive mind appears capable of accessing this entire genetic database, selecting and combining traits to produce organisms specifically suited to current tactical requirements. The speed at which new Tyranid bioforms can be generated remains a source of concern for Imperial strategists. Bioships function as mobile factories, constantly producing new organisms from digested biomass. A single hive ship can generate millions of organisms within days, provided sufficient resources. This reproductive capacity means that even successful defensive actions against Tyranid invasions often prove Pyrrhic victories. The biomass from defenders killed in battle simply feeds the creation of more Tyranids. Worlds that successfully repel initial invasions often find themselves facing larger subsequent waves, as the Hive Fleet converts fallen defenders into fresh attackers. The reconnaissance data from the Tyranid system prompted immediate escalation within the highest levels of Imperial command. Lord Commander of Ultramar Marnius Calgar convened emergency councils with his senior officers and representatives from the Adeptus Mechanicus, attempting to formulate a response to this unprecedented threat. The magnitude of what approached, however, exceeded even the most pessimistic projections. The destruction of Tyranid had not been an isolated incident. It was merely the first visible sign of a vast tendril of alien biomass that had entered the galaxy from the intergalactic void. Hive Fleet Behemoth emerged from beneath the galactic plane in 745 of the 41st millennium, its approach masked by the shadow in the warp until Imperial forces were already within its grasp. The fleet consisted of thousands of bioships, ranging from small drone vessels to massive hive ships several kilometers in length. These living spacecraft moved through the void without conventional propulsion, instead utilizing gravitic and biological processes that Imperial tech priests could not adequately explain. The fleet's trajectory carried it directly through the eastern fringe, placing dozens of Imperial worlds in its path. The Ultramar sector, crown jewel of the Ultramarines chapter, and one of the most prosperous regions in Segmentum Ultima, stood directly in the path of the approaching swarm. The worlds bordering the Tyranid system fell in rapid succession. Prandium, an agri-world producing food for a dozen neighboring systems, sent increasingly desperate astropathic messages describing creatures that fell from the sky in mycetic spores. These living drop pods burrowed into the soil upon impact, disgorging hormigons and termagants that swept across the fertile plains in chittering waves. The planet's planetary defense force established firing lines and attempted to hold the creatures at bay with massed lasgun volleys, but the Tyranids adapted with each assault. Organisms that survived the initial barrages returned in subsequent waves with thickened carapaces that deflected Law's fire. The defenders shifted to explosive ordnance, only to face Tyranids with redundant biological systems that continued functioning even after sustaining catastrophic damage. Within 3 weeks, Prandium went silent. Explorer vessels that investigated months later found a world completely denuded of life, its once green fields reduced to gray ash. The pattern repeated across multiple systems. Each world fought with whatever resources it possessed, and each world fell. The Tyranids demonstrated tactical flexibility that belied their alien nature. On fortress worlds with extensive orbital defenses, the Hive Fleet deployed mycetic spores that penetrated defensive fire through sheer numbers, accepting massive casualties to deliver ground forces directly to planetary surfaces. On worlds with dispersed populations, specialized Tyranid organisms called lictors infiltrated ahead of the main swarm, stalking and eliminating key personnel, while transmitting psychic coordinates back to the hive mind. Industrial worlds found their manufactorums overrun by creatures that seemed specifically designed to navigate urban environments, ravenas that burrowed through ferrocrete foundations, and gene-stealers that moved through ventilation systems with terrifying speed. The fall of Tyranid Primus itself provided Imperial forces with their first detailed observations of Tyranid assault methodology, though the knowledge came at catastrophic cost. The Ultramarines dispatched additional forces to reinforce the initial investigation team, only to discover that their strike cruiser had been completely consumed. The relief force, consisting of 3 companies of Ultramarines and supporting Imperial Guard regiments, established defensive positions in the primary Hive city. The Tyranids attacked in waves that tested different approaches and adaptations. Initial assaults consisted primarily of smaller organisms, hormagaunts that moved with blinding speed, their scything talons capable of disemboweling a man with a single strike. The Ultramarines' bolter fire proved effective, mass reactive rounds detonating inside Tyranid bodies and spraying ichor across the battlefield. The second wave incorporated what Imperial observers would later classify as warriors, larger, more heavily armored Tyranids that stood upright on 2 legs and wielded bioweapons integrated into their own bodies. These creatures fired living ammunition, projectiles that had been grown within the warrior's body and launched through muscular contractions. The projectiles, designated flesh borers by Imperial xenobiologists, burrowed into targets and consumed them from within. More disturbingly, these warriors demonstrated tactical intelligence, using cover and coordinating their attacks to suppress Imperial firing positions. When the Ultramarines focused their fire on these synapse creatures, the smaller organisms in proximity became disorganized and easier to eliminate. This observation would prove crucial in subsequent engagements. The third wave introduced carnifexes, living battering rams that combined the mass of Imperial battle tanks with biological weapon systems. These creatures shrugged off bolter fire, their chitinous armor plates thick enough to deflect all but the heaviest weapons. Las cannons and missile launchers became essential, though even these required multiple hits to bring down a single carnifex. The beasts charged Imperial lines with single-minded determination, crushing defenders beneath their bulk and tearing through fortifications with massive scything talons. Behind the carnifexes came more specialized organisms, biovores that launched explosive spores in high arcs, bombarding Imperial positions with living artillery, and zoanthropes that channeled psychic energy into devastating blasts that melted through ceramite and plasteel alike. The defenders of Tyranid Primus held for 6 days before the orbital situation deteriorated beyond recovery. Tyranid bioships had been steadily overwhelming the system's naval defenses, their numbers allowing them to absorb losses that would have crippled any conventional fleet. When the last Imperial vessels retreated or were destroyed, the bioships began their true work. Massive capillary towers descended from orbit, their roots burrowing deep into the planet's crust. These structures began converting the atmosphere, releasing spores and toxins that killed native vegetation while nourishing Tyranid organisms. The sky turned a sickly purple-green, and defenders without sealed armor began dying from respiratory failure. The Ultramarines fought their way to their remaining Thunderhawk gunships, extracting what survivors they could, but entire companies were left behind when Tyranid flyers, organisms designated as gargoyles and harpies, swarmed the extraction zones. The intelligence gathered from Tyranid Primus and other fallen worlds painted a dire picture. The Tyranids were not simply another Xenos threat to be contained or eliminated through conventional military doctrine. They represented a fundamentally different category of enemy, one that consumed everything in its path and grew stronger with each victory. Imperial strategists calculated that the biomass from each conquered world fueled the creation of more Tyranid organisms, creating a feedback loop where success bred exponential growth. The Hive Fleet was quite literally eating its way through the eastern fringe, converting Imperial citizens and resources into additional swarm components. Marneus Calgar recognized that the Tyranids would inevitably reach Ultramar. The question was not if, but when, and whether the Imperium could marshal sufficient forces to halt the invasion. He issued mobilization orders across the entire sector, calling upon every available military asset. Imperial Guard regiments were redirected from other theaters. The Ultramarine successor chapters received urgent requests for aid. The Adeptus Mechanicus began fortifying key worlds with additional defensive emplacements. Calgar himself took personal command of the defense of Macragge, the Ultramarines' home world and spiritual heart of Ultramar. The preparations proved prescient. In 745 of the 41st millennium, Hive Fleet Behemoth reached the Ultramar sector. The fleet's vanguard organisms, scout creatures, and advance infiltrators had been operating in the region for weeks, their presence unknown until the main fleet arrived. The Tyranids struck at multiple worlds simultaneously, demonstrating strategic coordination that suggested the hive mind possessed intelligence rivaling the greatest human military commanders. Smaller splinter fleets peeled off to attack secondary targets, while the main concentration of bioships advanced toward Macragge itself. The battle for Macragge began in orbit. The Ultramarines fleet, reinforced by vessels from the Imperial Navy and several Space Marine successor chapters, engaged the Tyranid bioships in a desperate attempt to prevent the swarm from reaching the planet's surface. The Void battle defied conventional naval doctrine. Tyranid bioships closed to boarding range and released boarding spores filled with genestealers and hormagaunts that tore through Imperial vessels from within. Imperial captains found that destroying bioships often proved counterproductive. The creatures' death throes released clouds of spores and smaller organisms that spread through nearby space, infesting other vessels. The Ultramarines' battle barges and strike cruisers focused their fire on the largest Hive ships, recognizing these as command nodes for the fleet's coordination. Despite inflicting massive casualties on the Tyranid fleet, Imperial forces could not prevent significant numbers of mycetic spores from reaching Macragge's surface. The planet's extensive defensive networks activated void shield generators protecting major population centers, while orbital defense platforms fired continuously at the descending spore clouds. Millions of spores were destroyed during atmospheric entry, but millions more survived, impacting across Macragge's surface and disgorging their living cargo. The ground war for Macragge tested the Ultramarines as they had never been tested before. The chapter deployed in full strength, 10 companies of Space Marines supported by chapter serfs, planetary defense forces, and Imperial Guard regiments that had been stationed in the system. Marneus Calgar established his command center in the Fortress of Hera, the Ultramarines' primary stronghold, and coordinated defensive operations across the entire planet. The Tyranids attacked everywhere simultaneously, their swarms emerging from impact craters and spreading across the landscape like a living flood. The polar fortresses of Macragge became critical defensive positions. These ancient strongholds, built during the Age of Strife and reinforced over millennia, guarded the approaches to the planet's major hive cities. The Ultramarines' First Company, the chapter's veteran elite clad in sacred tactical dreadnought armor, deployed to hold these positions. These Terminators represented the finest warriors the chapter possessed, each a veteran of centuries of warfare. They established firing lines in the fortress approaches and prepared to meet the Tyranid assault. The Tyranids came in numbers that beggared belief, hormagaunts and termagants in their millions, moving as a single organism directed by the hive mind's will. Behind them came the larger bioforms, warriors, carnifexes, and previously unseen organisms that Imperial observers struggled to classify. The Terminator's storm bolters cut down hundreds of creatures with each volley, their power fists and chain fists tearing apart anything that reached melee range. The Tyranids died in heaps, their bodies piling so high that subsequent waves had to climb over mountains of their own dead. Yet they kept coming, an endless tide that never wavered, never retreated, never showed fear or hesitation. The First Company held for 3 days, their ammunition supplies maintained by constant resupply runs from Thunderhawk gunships. On the 4th day, the Tyranids adapted. New organisms appeared in the swarm, creatures with thicker armor that could withstand storm bolter fire, and others that spat bioplasma capable of melting through Terminator plate. The synapse creatures directing the swarm had learned from previous assaults and adjusted their tactics accordingly. Rather than attacking in frontal waves, they began probing for weaknesses, testing different approaches until they identified vulnerable points in the defenses. The sacrifice of the first company bought time for evacuation of civilian populations from the surrounding regions and allowed other Ultramarines forces to establish secondary defensive lines. When the polar fortresses finally fell, fewer than a dozen Terminators escaped. The rest died in the final hours, fighting hand-to-hand against creatures that overwhelmed them through sheer mass. Their sacrifice was not in vain. The delay allowed Calgar to concentrate his remaining forces at more defensible positions and prevented the Tyranids from overrunning the planet's primary hive cities in the initial assault. The situation remained desperate. Tyranid organisms controlled vast swathes of Mukraga's surface, and the planet's atmosphere was beginning to show signs of contamination from the capillary towers that had taken root in conquered territories. Calgar recognized that victory on the ground was impossible without eliminating the orbital threat. The massive Hive ship coordinating the invasion hung in low orbit, a living command center kilometers in length that served as the focal point for the Hive mind's control over forces on the planet. Destroying it might disrupt the swarm's coordination and provide Imperial forces with the opportunity they needed. The Ultramarines launched a desperate boarding action. Thunderhawk gunships and boarding torpedoes carried assault teams directly to the Hive ship, their hulls protected by void shields and their cargo holds filled with the chapter's finest warriors. Calgar himself led the assault, accompanied by his honor guard and elements of the remaining veteran companies. The boarding action represented a calculated risk. If it failed, the Ultramarines would lose their chapter master and a significant portion of their remaining strength. The interior of the Hive ship defied human comprehension. Organic corridors pulsed with alien life, the walls themselves seeming to breathe. The air was thick with spores and biotoxins that would have killed unaugmented humans in seconds. The Ultramarines advanced through passages lined with organic matter, fighting past waves of defenders that the ship itself seemed to generate. Genestealers emerged from the walls, their rending claws capable of tearing through ceramite. Tyranid warriors coordinated defensive positions, their bioweapons filling corridors with flesh-boring projectiles and corrosive fluids. Calgar's force pushed deeper into the Hive ship, following psychic signatures that indicated the presence of the ship's central control organism. They encountered a creature that Imperial xenobiologists would later classify as a Norn Queen, a massive Tyranid bioform responsible for generating new organisms from digested biomass. The creature filled an entire chamber, its bulk connected to organic machinery that processed nutrients and assembled genetic sequences. Calgar engaged the Norn Queen directly, his power fists crushing through its armored carapace, while his honor guard eliminated the warrior organisms protecting it. The death of the Norn Queen triggered catastrophic failures throughout the Hive ship. Without its coordinating presence, the vessel's biological systems began shutting down. The Ultramarines fought their way back to their extraction points as the ship literally died around them, its corridors collapsing and its atmosphere venting into space. They escaped moments before the Hive ship broke apart, its massive bulk tumbling toward Mukraga's surface in pieces that burned up during atmospheric entry. The destruction of the Hive ship broke the Tyranid assault's momentum. On Mukraga's surface, synapse creatures lost coordination, and the swarms became disorganized. Imperial forces launched immediate counterattacks, exploiting the confusion to eliminate isolated Tyranid concentrations before the Hive mind could re-establish control through secondary command organisms. The battle continued for weeks, but the tide had turned. The Tyranids were pushed back from the major population centers, their remaining forces hunted down and eliminated by Space Marine strike forces. The victory came at devastating cost. The Ultramarines chapter had been reduced to approximately 200 battle brothers, less than a quarter of their pre-invasion strength. The first company had been effectively annihilated. Mukrag itself bore terrible scars. Entire regions had been stripped of life, their ecosystems destroyed by Tyranid consumption. Other worlds in the Ultramar sector had suffered even worse fates. Several planets had been completely consumed, their populations devoured, and their resources converted into Tyranid biomass. The economic and military infrastructure of the entire sector would require decades to rebuild. The most disturbing revelation came from Adeptus Mechanicus analysis of the defeated Hive Fleets' remains. Genetic sampling and biomass calculations indicated that Behemoth represented only a splinter fleet, a relatively small tendril of a much larger organism. Somewhere in the intergalactic void, the main body of the Tyranid swarm continued its approach toward the galaxy. The battle for Mukrag had been a victory, but it was merely the opening engagement in a war that threatened the survival of all life in the Milky Way. The great devourer had tasted the Imperium's strength, and the hive mind was learning. The Imperium had barely begun recovering from the devastation of Hive Fleet Behemoth when the second major Tyranid incursion manifested in 992 of the 41st millennium. Hive Fleet Kraken announced its arrival not through a single concentrated thrust like its predecessor, but through a revolutionary strategic approach that would fundamentally alter Imperial understanding of Tyranid capabilities. Where Behemoth had advanced as a unified mass, Kraken fragmented into dozens of separate tendril fleets, each capable of independent operation while remaining connected through the Gestalt consciousness of the hive mind. This multi-pronged assault struck across a front spanning thousands of light years, overwhelming the Imperium's ability to coordinate effective responses and forcing Imperial commanders to fight dozens of separate wars simultaneously. The initial detection of Kraken came from Adeptus Mechanicus listening stations monitoring the eastern fringe. Astropaths reported the familiar psychic pressure of the shadow in the warp, but the signature differed from Behemoth's concentrated presence. Instead of a single overwhelming darkness, the shadow manifested as multiple zones of psychic interference scattered across segmentum ultima. Imperial strategists initially theorized they were detecting several smaller hive fleets approaching independently. The horrifying truth emerged when explorator vessels mapped the tendril trajectories. All the separate fleets originated from the same source, a massive concentration of bioships that had deliberately split into autonomous attack groups before entering the galaxy proper. This tactical evolution demonstrated the hive mind's capacity for strategic learning. The defeat of Behemoth had taught the Tyranids that concentrated forces, while powerful, presented a single target that Imperial forces could focus their defensive efforts against. Kraken's dispersed approach meant that the Imperium could not marshal its full military strength against any single tendril without leaving other regions vulnerable to the remaining attack vectors. Space Marine chapters found themselves unable to concentrate their forces, instead deploying companies and even individual squads to bolster defenses across multiple sectors. The Imperial Navy faced impossible decisions about which worlds to defend and which to abandon, knowing that every ship committed to one battle was a ship unavailable elsewhere. The world of Ikar IV became the site of one of Kraken's most devastating early victories and illustrated the horrific efficiency of the new Tyranid strategy. This fortress world guarded a critical junction of stable warp routes through the eastern fringe, making it a strategic nexus for Imperial military operations in the region. The planetary defenses included extensive orbital platforms, multiple regiments of Imperial Guard, and significant Adeptus Mechanicus manufacturing facilities that produced war materiel for the surrounding sectors. When a Kraken tendril entered the Ikar system, Imperial forces prepared for a conventional Tyranid assault based on intelligence gathered from the Behemoth invasion. The Tyranids attacked with organisms that demonstrated clear adaptations based on previous Imperial defensive successes. The mycetic spores that rained down on Ikar IV incorporated biological countermeasures against standard anti-aircraft fire, ablative layers that burned away under laser fire while protecting the living cargo within, and erratic flight patterns that made targeting calculations difficult. The initial waves of ground organisms included significantly higher proportions of synapse creatures than had been observed during Behemoth's attacks, ensuring that even when Imperial forces eliminated individual coordinators, others remained nearby to maintain swarm cohesion. The defenders of Ikar IV fought with desperate determination, knowing that the loss of their world would compromise Imperial control over the entire subsector. The Ultramarines dispatched 3 companies to reinforce the defense, while elements of the sides of the Emperor chapter arrived from their nearby home world of Satha. Imperial Guard regiments established killing zones in the approaches to the primary Hive cities, their heavy weapons teams targeting the larger Tyranid bioforms, while infantry squads dealt with the smaller organisms that inevitably slipped through the defensive fire. The battle devolved into a grinding war of attrition that lasted for months. The Tyranids demonstrated patience that contradicted their reputation as mindless beasts, probing defenses and testing different attack vectors rather than committing to wasteful frontal assaults. They deployed lictors that infiltrated Imperial positions days before major attacks, these chameleonic hunters eliminating officers and sabotaging communications equipment. When the main swarms attacked, they struck at locations where command structures had been decapitated, exploiting the resulting confusion to breach defensive lines. The sides of the Emperor bore the brunt of the heaviest fighting, their companies deployed across multiple fronts to plug gaps in the defensive perimeter. These Space Marines fought with the tactical flexibility their chapter was renowned for, adapting their strategies to counter Tyranid innovations as they appeared. When the Tyranids deployed Ravenas that burrowed beneath defensive fortifications, the Scythes collapsed tunnel networks and established new firing positions. When Bio-Titans appeared on the battlefield, towering hierophants that dwarfed even Imperial Knights, the chapter's Devastator squads concentrated their las cannons and missile launchers on these priority targets, bringing them down through coordinated fire. The orbital situation deteriorated steadily despite Imperial naval efforts. The Tyranid bioships employed tactics that suggested they had analyzed the void battles around Macragge and identified weaknesses in Imperial naval doctrine. Rather than closing to boarding range where Imperial vessels could bring their superior close-range firepower to bear, the bioships maintained distance and deployed clouds of spore mines, living explosives that drifted through space until they contacted Imperial hulls. These weapons forced Imperial captains to maneuver constantly, reducing the effectiveness of their targeting solutions and preventing them from establishing stable firing positions. When the orbital defenses finally collapsed, the Tyranids began their systematic consumption of Ikar IV. Capillary towers descended from orbit, their massive structures visible from hundreds of kilometers away. The atmosphere began changing within days, the sky taking on the characteristic purple-green hue that marked worlds undergoing Tyranid digestion. Imperial forces recognized that the battle was lost and began evacuation operations, prioritizing military personnel and essential technical specialists. Millions of civilians remained behind, their fate sealed when the last transport vessels departed the system. The fall of Ikar IV sent shockwaves through Imperial command structures in Segmentum Ultima. If a fortress world with substantial Space Marine support could fall to a single Kraken tendril, what hope did less defended worlds have? The answer came swiftly as reports flooded in from across the eastern fringe. Dozens of worlds were under simultaneous attack, each facing Tyranid forces that had been specifically adapted to counter local defensive capabilities. Agri-worlds found themselves assaulted by organisms optimized for rapid consumption of plant matter. Mining worlds faced Tyranids that could survive in toxic atmospheres and extreme temperatures. Hive worlds were invaded by gene-stealers that moved through the densely packed urban environments with terrifying efficiency. The coordination failures among Imperial forces exacerbated the crisis. The shadow and the warp prevented effective astropathic communication between besieged worlds, leaving each system to fight in isolation without knowledge of the broader strategic situation. Reinforcement fleets dispatched to aid one world often arrived to find it already consumed, forcing them to redirect to other threatened systems. The bureaucratic mechanisms of the Administratum, designed for managing the Imperium's vast territories over timescales of years or decades, proved catastrophically inadequate for responding to the rapidly evolving Tyranid threat. Space Marine chapters found themselves stretched beyond sustainable operational capacity. The Ultramarines, still rebuilding from their losses against Behemoth, deployed companies across multiple sectors despite their reduced strength. The Mortifactors chapter committed their full strength to defending worlds in the Tendrils system, fighting a brutal campaign that cost them nearly half their battle brothers. The Lamenters, already depleted from previous conflicts, arrived at the Devlin system to find 3 separate Kraken tendrils converging on the region's industrial worlds. These Space Marines fought with characteristic determination, but even their enhanced capabilities could not overcome the fundamental mathematics of the situation. The Tyranids simply had more forces than the Imperium could deploy to counter them. The assault on Craftworld Eandon represented Kraken's most audacious attack and demonstrated that the hive mind's appetite extended beyond human worlds. Eandon, one of the largest surviving Eldari craftworlds, had been monitoring the Tyranid advance with growing concern. The craftworld's farseers had perceived the psychic shadow of the Hive Fleets in their divinations, recognizing the existential threat the Tyranids posed to all life in the galaxy. When a massive Kraken tendril altered course and began pursuing Eandon through the void, the Eldari realized they had become targets. The craftworld's population mobilized for war, every able-bodied Eldari taking up arms in defense of their home. Aspect warriors emerged from their shrines, these specialist fighters representing the pinnacle of Eldari military capability. Dire Avengers established defensive positions throughout the craftworld's infinity circuit chambers, protecting the spirit stones that housed the souls of dead Eldari. Howling Banshees prepared to meet the Tyranid assault in close combat, their power weapons and enhanced agility giving them advantages in the confined spaces of Eandon's internal structure. Dark Reapers positioned their heavy weapons to cover the major approach vectors, their missile launchers and shuriken cannons ready to cut down Tyranid organisms before they could establish beachheads. The Tyranid assault began with boarding actions on a scale that dwarfed anything the Eldari had previously encountered. Mycetic spores impacted across Eandon's hull, their living cargo burrowing through the craftworld's wraithbone structure and emerging in corridors and chambers throughout the vessel. The initial waves consisted primarily of genestealers, these infiltrator organisms ideally suited for fighting in the tight confines of interior spaces. Their forearms ended in rending claws that could tear through wraithbone and Eldari armor with equal ease, and their speed allowed them to close with defenders before ranged weapons could bring them down. The Eldari fought with desperate skill, their centuries of combat experience and psychic abilities providing advantages that human defenders lacked. Warlocks channeled the power of the warp to incinerate groups of Tyranid organisms, their psychic flames burning through chitin and flesh. Striking Scorpions ambushed Tyranid infiltrators, their chainsabers and mandiblasters eliminating threats before they could compromise critical systems. The craftworld's Avatar of Kine, a fragment of the bloody-handed god given physical form, waded through the Tyranid swarms with its massive blade, each swing cutting down dozens of lesser organisms. Despite their skill and determination, the Eldari could not prevent the Tyranids from establishing multiple strongpoints within Eandon. The sheer numbers of organisms that poured through the breach sections overwhelmed defensive positions through attrition. Tyranid warriors coordinated attacks that isolated Eldari forces, cutting them off from reinforcement and eliminating them piecemeal. Carnifexes smashed through barricades that would have stopped lesser creatures, their massive bulk and armored carapaces allowing them to shrug off weapons fire that killed smaller organisms. Zoanthropes channeled psychic energy into devastating attacks that melted through wraithbone bulkheads, creating new breach points that additional Tyranids exploited. The fighting raged for weeks, every corridor and chamber becoming a battlefield. The Eldari population suffered catastrophic losses as entire sections of the craftworld fell to the Tyranid advance. The Infinity Circuit itself came under threat when Tyranid organisms reached the chambers housing the Spirit Stones. The loss of these sacred artifacts represented not just physical death, but the annihilation of Eldari souls, a fate worse than any physical destruction. Guardian defenders fought with suicidal determination to protect the Spirit Stones, knowing that failure meant the permanent death of their ancestors and the weakening of their entire civilization. The situation had deteriorated to the point of complete collapse when Prince Imperial arrived with reinforcements. This legendary Eldari corsair had been exiled from Eandon decades earlier, following political disputes with the Craftworld's leadership, but he returned when word reached him of his home's desperate situation. Imperial brought with him his corsair fleet and warriors who had fought across the galaxy, veterans of countless battles who understood warfare in ways that Craftworld Eldari often did not. More significantly, he wielded the Spear of Twilight, an ancient weapon of tremendous power that came with a terrible curse. Each time Imperial used it, the weapon drained a portion of his life force. Imperial's forces struck at the Tyranid concentrations with coordinated precision that disrupted the hive mind's control over forces within the Craftworld. His corsairs targeted synapse creatures specifically, recognizing that eliminating these coordination nodes would cause the lesser organisms to become disorganized. The strategy worked, though it required Imperial to personally engage some of the largest and most dangerous Tyranid bioforms. The Spear of Twilight proved devastatingly effective against Tyranid organisms, its ancient technology burning through their adaptive defenses and killing even massive creatures with single strikes. The counterattack succeeded in driving the Tyranids from Eandon's interior, though the victory came at a cost that would haunt the Craftworld for millennia. More than 80% of Eandon's population had been killed during the invasion, their souls claimed by the Tyranids, or lost to she who thirsts in the chaos of battle. Vast sections of the Craftworld lay in ruins, their wraithbone structures damaged beyond repair. The spirit stones of countless ancestors had been destroyed, representing an irreplaceable loss of knowledge and wisdom. Eandon survived, but it would never recover its former glory. The Craftworld's remaining population turned increasingly to wraith constructs, artificial bodies animated by the spirits of dead Eldari, to make up for their depleted numbers, transforming Eandon into a vessel crewed primarily by the dead. The trauma inflicted on Eandon's survivors manifested in profound psychological and cultural changes. The Eldari who had witnessed the Tyranid assault understood in a visceral way that the Great Devourer represented an existential threat to their species. Unlike the forces of chaos or the Imperium of man, the Tyranids could not be reasoned with, manipulated, or avoided through foresight. They simply consumed, adapting to counter any defense and learning from every engagement. This realization spread through Eldari society as refugees from Eandon carried their accounts to other Craftworlds, fundamentally altering how the Eldari perceived and responded to the Tyranid threat. The fragmentation of Hive Fleet Kraken that had made it so effective initially ultimately contributed to its defeat. Imperial forces, after suffering catastrophic losses across dozens of systems, began coordinating counterattacks that targeted individual tendrils in sequence. Space Marine strike forces would concentrate their full strength against a single tendril, overwhelming it through superior firepower and tactical flexibility before redeploying to engage the next threat. The strategy accepted that some worlds would fall while Imperial forces focused elsewhere, but it prevented the complete collapse of Imperial control across entire sectors. The Ultramarines led several of these concentrated counterattacks, their experience fighting Behemoth providing crucial tactical insights. They identified patterns in Tyranid behavior that suggested the tendrils, while capable of independent operation, still required periodic reconnection with larger fleet elements to share genetic information and absorbed biomass. Imperial forces began targeting these reconnection points, attacking Tyranid fleet concentrations when they were most vulnerable. The strategy yielded significant successes, with several major tendrils being destroyed or scattered before they could rejoin the main Hive fleet. The eventual fragmentation of Kraken resulted from cumulative losses across all its tendril fleets, combined with coordinated Imperial counteroffensives that prevented the remaining tendrils from consolidating. By the late 990s of the 41st millennium, Kraken no longer existed as a unified Hive fleet. Instead, dozens of splinter fleets continued operating independently across the eastern fringe and beyond, each following its own trajectory and consuming whatever worlds lay in its path. These splinter fleets remain active to the present day, a persistent threat that ties down Imperial military forces and prevents full concentration against newer Hive Fleet incursions. The Imperium's attention had been focused on the eastern fringe for over 2 centuries, watching for signs of renewed Tyranid incursions from the direction where Behemoth and Kraken had emerged. This fixation on a single threat vector proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. In 997 of the 41st millennium, astropaths across the southern reaches of the galaxy began reporting the now familiar psychic pressure of the shadow in the warp, but the direction of approach defied all expectations. Hive Fleet Leviathan had not entered from the eastern fringe, but from below the galactic plane, approaching from the southern regions, where few Imperial observers had thought to maintain vigilance. The scale of this new invasion exceeded anything previously encountered. Leviathan dwarfed both Behemoth and Kraken combined, its biomass suggesting it represented not a splinter or tendril, but a substantial portion of the main Tyranid swarm that had been traversing the intergalactic void for millions of years. The strategic implications became apparent within weeks of initial contact. Leviathan had fragmented into dozens of major tendrils before entering the galaxy, adopting the multi-pronged approach that had proven effective for Kraken while operating on a vastly larger scale. These tendrils spread across both the eastern and western fringes simultaneously, creating a front that stretched across thousands of light years and threatened dozens of sectors. Imperial forces found themselves facing Tyranid incursions in regions that had never encountered the Great Devourer, worlds whose defenders had no experience fighting organisms that adapted to counter their defensive strategies. The Imperium's military resources, already strained by constant warfare against chaos, orcs, and the various Xenos threats throughout the galaxy, could not possibly cover all threatened regions adequately. The genetic analysis of captured Leviathan organisms revealed disturbing evidence of continued hive mind evolution. These Tyranids incorporated biological traits from species that Behemoth and Kraken had consumed, suggesting that the separate hive fleets maintained some form of connection that allowed them to share genetic information across vast distances. Leviathan's warriors demonstrated resistances to weapons that had proven effective against earlier hive fleets. Their carapaces incorporated heat-dispersing structures that reduced the effectiveness of plasma weapons. Their bodies contained redundant organs that allowed them to continue functioning even after sustaining damage that would have killed Behemoth or Kraken organisms. Most concerning, Leviathan deployed significantly higher proportions of psychically active organisms, including new bioforms that Imperial xenobiologists struggled to classify. One of Leviathan's major tendrils drove directly toward the Baal system, home world of the Blood Angels chapter, and their numerous successor chapters. This trajectory appeared deliberate rather than coincidental, suggesting the hive mind specifically targeted concentrations of Space Marine gene seed as valuable genetic material. The Blood Angels and their successors recognized the existential threat approaching their home and issued calls for aid that reached chapters across the Imperium. Dozens of Space Marine chapters responded, redirecting forces from other theaters to participate in what would become known as the Shield of Baal campaign. The Cryptus system became the first major battleground in this sector. This collection of worlds served as a critical waypoint between the outer reaches of the Baal sector and the Blood Angels' home world itself. If Cryptus fell quickly, the Tyranids would have a clear approach to Baal with minimal Imperial defenses in their path. Commander Dante, chapter master of the Blood Angels and one of the oldest living Space Marines in the Imperium, coordinated the defense personally. His strategic acumen, honed over more than 1,000 years of warfare, would be tested as never before. The world of Asphodex became the focal point of initial defensive efforts. This Death World's hostile environment had produced some of the Imperium's finest soldiers, its population adapted to surviving among predatory fauna that would kill unaugmented humans within hours. The planetary defense forces understood how to fight in their world's jungles and swamps, using terrain and natural hazards to their advantage. When the Tyranid mycetic spores began falling, the defenders implemented guerrilla tactics that had served them well against previous invaders. Small units harassed Tyranid concentrations, striking from concealment and withdrawing before the swarms could bring their numbers to bear. The Tyranids adapted with horrifying speed. Within days, they deployed organisms specifically suited to a Sphodex's environment, creatures that could navigate the dense jungle canopy, others that moved through the swamps without triggering the planet's natural predators, and toxin-resistant bioforms that shrugged off the venomous plants that lined many approaches to human settlements. The hive mind had analyzed the defensive tactics and produced organisms optimized to counter them. Lictor infiltrators stalked human guerrilla units through the jungle, their chameleonic abilities making them nearly invisible until they struck. Ravenous burrowed through the swamp beds, emerging directly beneath defensive positions that the defenders had thought secure. The Blood Angels deployed 3 companies to reinforce a Sphodex, recognizing that losing the world quickly would compromise the entire Cryptus defensive strategy. These Space Marines brought orbital fire support and armored vehicles that the planetary defense forces lacked, establishing fortified positions that could withstand sustained Tyranid assaults. The fighting devolved into a grinding war of attrition across multiple fronts, with neither side able to achieve decisive breakthrough. The Blood Angels held critical positions through sheer determination and superior firepower, but the Tyranids controlled vast swathes of territory and continued landing reinforcements from orbit. The arrival of additional Space Marine chapters shifted the balance temporarily. The Flesh Terrors, a Blood Angels successor chapter known for their ferocity in close combat, reinforced the northern defensive lines. The Knights of Blood, despite being declared renegades by the Inquisition due to their inability to control the Red Thirst, arrived to defend their parent chapter's home sector. Even the Lamenters, perpetually cursed by misfortune and still recovering from their losses against Kraken, dispatched what forces they could spare. This concentration of Space Marine strength represented one of the largest gatherings of Adeptus Astartes forces since the Badab War, though the circumstances that necessitated it were far more dire. The void battles around Cryptus demonstrated Leviathan's naval capabilities. The Tyranid bioships employed tactics that suggested they had absorbed lessons from previous fleet engagements across the galaxy. They deployed spore mines in patterns that channeled Imperial vessels into kill zones where larger bioships waited to overwhelm them. Hive ships hung back from the main engagement, generating fresh organisms to replace losses rather than committing themselves to direct combat where Imperial capital ships could target them. The smaller bioships attacked in coordinated waves, accepting catastrophic casualties to wear down Imperial void shields and point defense systems. The naval situation deteriorated when Leviathan deployed a new class of bioship that Imperial observers designated as the Void Kraken. These massive organisms dwarfed standard Hive ships, their tentacles capable of crushing Imperial cruisers, and their bioweapons powerful enough to punch through void shields with single volleys. The appearance of multiple Void Krakens forced Imperial naval commanders to commit their battleships and battle barges to direct engagement, vessels that were irreplaceable, and whose loss would cripple Imperial naval strength in the sector for decades. The ground war on Asphodex reached its crisis point when the Tyranids deployed Bio-Titans in numbers that overwhelmed the defenders' ability to counter them. These towering organisms, including Hierophants and the massive Harridan flyers, smashed through defensive lines that had held for weeks. Their bioplasma weapons melted through fortifications and armor with equal ease, while their sheer size allowed them to crush infantry and light vehicles beneath their bulk. The Space Marines concentrated their heavy weapons on these priority targets, but destroying a single Bio-Titan required sustained fire from multiple lascannons or missile launchers, and the Tyranids deployed dozens of them across multiple fronts simultaneously. Commander Dante made the difficult decision to evacuate Asphodex when it became clear that holding the world would require committing forces needed for the defense of other Cryptus worlds. The withdrawal proceeded under constant Tyranid pressure, with rearguard units fighting desperate holding actions to allow the main force to reach extraction points. The Flesh Terrors volunteered for the final rearguard, their assault squads engaging Tyranid forces in brutal close combat that bought crucial hours for the evacuation fleet. When the last Thunderhawks departed Asphodex, fewer than half the flesh terrors who had landed on the world remained alive. The pattern repeated across the Cryptus system. Each world fought with everything available, and each world eventually fell when Tyranid numbers overwhelmed defensive capabilities. The Knights of Blood made their final stand on Lysios, holding a critical orbital defense platform against wave after wave of Tyranid boarding organisms. They fought for 3 days without rest, their positions surrounded by mountains of Tyranid corpses, but eventually the sheer mass of attackers breached their final defensive line. The chapter was annihilated to the last battle brother, their sacrifice buying time for evacuation convoys to escape the system. The retreat from Cryptus concentrated Imperial forces at Baal itself, where Commander Dante prepared for what he knew would be the decisive battle. The Blood Angels' home world possessed defenses that had been reinforced over 10 millennia, including extensive orbital platforms, void shield networks protecting the major population centers, and fortifications that could withstand sustained bombardment. The 2 moons of Baal, Baal Primus and Baal Secundus, served as additional defensive positions, their surfaces covered with weapons emplacements and garrison forces. The Tyranid assault on the Baal system began with a void battle of unprecedented scale. Hundreds of bioships emerged from the shadow in the warp, their numbers so vast that they literally blocked out the stars. The Imperial fleet, reinforced by vessels from across the sector, engaged in a desperate defense of the orbital space. Battle barges and strike cruisers from a dozen Space Marine chapters fought alongside Imperial Navy battleships, their combined firepower destroying bioships by the dozens. The Tyranids accepted these losses, using destroyed vessels as cover for subsequent waves and deploying boarding organisms that infiltrated Imperial ships through breaches created by bioplasma weapons. The fighting in orbit lasted for weeks, with neither side able to achieve decisive advantage. Imperial vessels maintained control over the immediate orbital space around Baal, but the Tyranids established positions around the system's outer planets and moons, using these as staging grounds for continued assaults. The bioships demonstrated patience that contradicted their reputation for mindless aggression, probing Imperial defenses and testing different approach vectors rather than committing to wasteful frontal attacks. The situation on Baal's surface evolved into a siege that tested the Blood Angels, as they had not been tested since the Horus Heresy. Tyranid organisms that penetrated the orbital defenses landed across the planet's already hostile environment, the radiation-scarred wastelands providing no obstacle to creatures adapted to survive in the void between galaxies. The Blood Angels deployed their full chapter strength, supported by their successor chapters and Imperial Guard regiments that had been stationed in the system. Every Space Marine who could hold a weapon took position in the defensive lines, including veterans of the chapter's Death Company, whose madness made them fearsome close combat specialists. The fortress monastery of the Blood Angels became the focal point of the defense. This ancient structure, built during the Great Crusade and reinforced over millennia, housed the chapter's gene seed repositories and relics dating back to Sanguinius himself. Its loss would mean not just the death of the chapter, but the destruction of irreplaceable artifacts and genetic material. Commander Dante established his command center in the fortress's highest tower, coordinating defensive operations across the entire system, while personally leading counterattacks when Tyranid forces threatened critical positions. The Tyranids deployed organisms specifically adapted to counter Space Marine capabilities. New bioforms appeared that moved with speed rivaling assault marines, their enhanced musculature allowing them to keep pace with jump pack-equipped warriors. Tyranid warriors with enhanced synaptic capabilities coordinated attacks with precision that matched Space Marine tactical doctrine. Carnifexes with reinforced carapaces shrugged off bolter fire that would have killed earlier generations of the organism, requiring concentrated fire from heavy weapons to bring down. The arrival of the Hive Fleet's central mass brought new horrors. Massive bioships descended into low orbit, their bulk visible from the planet's surface as they began deploying capillary towers. These structures, each kilometers tall, began converting Baal's already thin atmosphere into the toxic soup that would facilitate Tyranid digestion of the planet's biomass. The Blood Angels launched desperate strikes against these towers, knowing that if they became fully established, Baal would become uninhabitable even if the Tyranids were eventually driven off. The situation had deteriorated to the point where defeat seemed inevitable when the galaxy itself intervened. The Great Rift tore open across the Imperium, the massive warp storm splitting the galaxy in half and disrupting the Astronomican's light. The psychic shockwave that accompanied this catastrophic event rippled through the warp, affecting every psychically sensitive being in the galaxy. The Tyranid hive mind, its consciousness existing partially in the warp, recoiled from the sudden surge of chaotic energy. Across the Baal system, Tyranid organisms faltered as the synaptic network that bound them together experienced catastrophic disruption. The Blood Angels exploited this confusion immediately, launching coordinated counterattacks against Tyranid positions that had been impregnable moments before. Without the hive mind's coordination, the lesser organisms reverted to base instincts, becoming disorganized and vulnerable. The Space Marines cut through these scattered forces, eliminating synapse creatures and preventing the hive mind from reestablishing control. The disruption lasted for days, during which Imperial forces systematically destroyed Tyranid concentrations across Baal and its moons. The Tyranid bioships in orbit suffered equally severe disruption. Without coordination from the hive mind, they became vulnerable to concentrated Imperial naval fire. The fleet that had seemed unstoppable weeks earlier was reduced to scattered elements fleeing the system or being destroyed by Imperial vessels that pursued them relentlessly. The massive hive ships that had deployed the capillary towers attempted to withdraw, but the Blood Angels' battle barges focused their bombardment cannons on these priority targets, destroying several before they could escape. The victory at Baal came at catastrophic cost. The Blood Angels chapter had lost more than half its strength, with several successor chapters effectively destroyed as fighting forces. The planet itself bore terrible scars, vast regions reduced to lifeless desert where Tyranid digestion had begun before being interrupted. The two moons had suffered even worse damage, their surfaces stripped of the thin atmosphere they once possessed. Commander Dante himself had been grievously wounded during the final battles, his ancient body sustained only by the Blood Angels' most advanced life support technology. The disruption caused by the Great Rift's opening affected Leviathan's tendrils across the galaxy, but the Hive Fleet proved resilient in ways that terrified Imperial strategists. Within months, the scattered elements began re-establishing synaptic connections, reforming into coherent fleet elements that resumed their advance. The hive mind had adapted to the changed psychic environment, incorporating defenses against the warp storms that now ravaged the galaxy. This demonstrated once again the Tyranids' fundamental nature. They learned from every experience, adapted to every setback, and returned stronger than before. The Octarius sector became the site of Leviathan's most significant engagement outside the Baal campaign, though the circumstances differed dramatically from typical Tyranid invasions. This region of space housed one of the largest orc empires in the galaxy, a massive concentration of greenskins that had been growing unchecked for centuries. The orcs of Octarius had developed a sophisticated society by their standards, with numerous clans competing for dominance while maintaining enough unity to repel external threats. Their numbers exceeded anything short of the largest orc was, and their territory included dozens of worlds that had been completely overrun by greenskin infestation. A radical inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos had deliberately directed a Tyranid splinter fleet toward Octarius years earlier, theorizing that the two Xenos threats would destroy each other in a war of attrition that would benefit the Imperium. This strategy proved catastrophically short-sighted. When Leviathan's tendrils reached the Octarius sector, they encountered not a weakened orc population, but a thriving empire that had been fighting the earlier Tyranid incursion for years and adapting to counter their tactics. The collision between Leviathan and the Octarius orcs created a war on a scale that dwarfed most Imperial conflicts. The orcs responded to the Tyranid invasion with characteristic enthusiasm, viewing the arrival of Leviathan as the best fight they had experienced in generations. The Greenskins mobilized their entire society for war, every clan contributing warriors to the massive armies that met the Tyranid swarms in battles that consumed entire worlds. The Orcs' rapid reproduction rate, normally a significant advantage against conventional enemies, proved inadequate against Tyranids who could convert fallen Orc biomass into fresh organisms. However, the Orcs' natural resilience and tendency to grow larger and stronger through constant combat meant that veteran Orc warriors who survived battles against the Tyranids became increasingly formidable opponents. The war in Octarius created a feedback loop that benefited both sides while threatening to spiral out of control. The Tyranids consumed Orc biomass and used it to generate more organisms, but the Orc spores ensured that even consumed greenskins would eventually produce new Orcs from the soil where they died. The constant warfare caused the Orc population to grow larger and more aggressive, while the Tyranids adapted to counter Orc tactics and developed organisms specifically optimized for fighting greenskins. Imperial observers watching from the sector's periphery reported battles involving millions of combatants on single worlds, with neither side able to achieve decisive victory. The Octarius War continues to escalate in the current era, with both Tyranid and Orc populations growing despite massive casualties on both sides. The conflict has begun spreading beyond the original sector boundaries as elements of both forces expand into neighboring regions. Imperial worlds near Octarius face the nightmare scenario of fighting both Tyranids and Orcs simultaneously, the two Xenos threats having been strengthened rather than weakened by their mutual conflict. The Inquisitor whose actions initiated this catastrophe has been declared excommunicate traitoris, though this provides little comfort to the populations suffering the consequences of his miscalculation. Leviathan's current status represents the Imperium's greatest ongoing strategic concern regarding the Tyranid threat. Unlike Behemoth, which was defeated, or Kraken, which fragmented into manageable splinter fleets, Leviathan remains largely intact despite suffering massive losses at Baal and in countless other engagements across the galaxy. The Hive Fleet's tendrils continue advancing through both the eastern and western fringes, consuming worlds and growing stronger with each victory. The biomass calculations performed by the Adeptus Mechanicus suggest that Leviathan has already consumed resources equivalent to hundreds of Imperial worlds, converting this material into additional bioships and organisms that fuel continued expansion. The truly inexhaustible nature of the Tyranid swarm manifests most clearly in Leviathan's operations. Imperial forces have destroyed bioships numbering in the thousands, eliminated billions of individual organisms, and successfully defended dozens of worlds against invasion. Yet the Hive Fleet shows no signs of weakening or retreating. New tendrils continue emerging from the galactic south, suggesting that Leviathan represents only the vanguard of a much larger force still approaching from the intergalactic void. Each defeated tendril is replaced by fresh forces. Each destroyed bioship is regenerated from consumed biomass. Each adaptation that Imperial forces develop to counter Tyranid tactics is met with counter-adaptations that restore the Hive Fleet's effectiveness. The psychological impact on Imperial forces facing Leviathan cannot be understated. Soldiers who survive battles against the Tyranids often report a profound sense of futility, the understanding that no matter how many enemies they kill, more will always come. The shadow in the warp's psychic pressure affects even non-psychers, manifesting as an oppressive dread that saps morale and makes coordinated defense more difficult. Entire Imperial Guard regiments have broken and fled when faced with Tyranid swarms, their discipline crumbling under the weight of fighting an enemy that feels no fear, accepts any casualties, and adapts to counter every defensive strategy. The classification of Hive Fleets into major and minor categories represents an administrative convenience rather than an accurate reflection of the threat each poses. What Imperial strategists designate as minor Hive Fleets have demonstrated capabilities that would classify them as apocalyptic threats in any other context. These fleets, while smaller than Behemoth, Kraken, or Leviathan, display specialized adaptations and strategic approaches that make them uniquely dangerous. The hive mind's capacity for innovation manifests differently in each fleet, suggesting either deliberate experimentation with various invasion strategies or adaptation to specific environmental and tactical challenges encountered during their approach to the galaxy. Hive Fleet Gorgon emerged in the latter years of the 41st millennium, its initial contact with Imperial forces occurring in the Tiamat system before spreading across multiple sectors. What distinguished Gorgon from previous Hive Fleet encounters was not its size or strategic approach, but the unprecedented speed of its evolutionary responses. Imperial forces engaging Gorgon organisms discovered that adaptations which had taken weeks or months to manifest in Behemoth or Kraken appeared within days or even hours when fighting Gorgon. The hive mind had refined its adaptive mechanisms to such a degree that individual battles became laboratories for real-time evolution. The Tau Empire encountered Gorgon during the fleet's advance through the Perdis Rift region, providing the Imperium with detailed intelligence on this phenomenon through captured Tau records. The Tau approached the Tyranid threat with their characteristic belief in technological superiority and tactical doctrine, deploying fire-cast strike teams equipped with pulse rifles and rail weapons that had proven effective against other enemies. The initial engagements proceeded according to Tau expectations, their advanced weaponry cutting down Tyranid organisms with efficiency that suggested a manageable threat. The second wave of Tyranid attacks, arriving less than a solar day later, demonstrated complete resistance to pulse weapon fire. The organism's carapaces had developed heat-dispersing structures that rendered pulse rifles nearly ineffective, forcing the Tau to adapt their tactics on the fly. The Tau deployed their heavy battle suits, crisis and broadside configurations that carried weapons capable of penetrating the enhanced carapaces. These proved effective for approximately 3 days before Gorgon organisms appeared with redundant biological systems that allowed them to continue functioning even after sustaining damage that should have been catastrophic. A broadside team reported destroying a Carnifex with sustained rail rifle fire, only to watch the creature regenerate its damaged organs and resume its attack within minutes. The Tau Earthcast scientists studying captured Gorgon specimens discovered that the organisms possessed genetic sequences that activated in response to specific types of damage, triggering rapid cellular regeneration and structural adaptation. The most disturbing demonstration of Gorgon's adaptive speed occurred when the Tau deployed toxin weapons, believing that biological agents would prove more effective than conventional arms. The Watercast had developed sophisticated neurotoxins designed to disrupt synaptic functions in carbon-based life forms, compounds that had proven effective against orc populations and other biological threats. The initial deployment killed thousands of Gorgon organisms, their nervous systems shutting down as the toxins spread through their bodies. The Tau considered this a significant breakthrough and began mass-producing the toxin for widespread deployment. The next Tyranid wave demonstrated complete immunity to the neurotoxin. Gorgon organisms metabolized the compound without apparent effect, their bodies having developed biological filters that neutralized the toxin before it could reach critical systems. More horrifying, some organisms had adapted to use the toxin as a nutrient source, actually growing stronger when exposed to it. The Tau found themselves facing Tyranids that sought out areas where the toxin had been deployed, consuming contaminated biomass and incorporating the chemical compounds into their own bioweapons. Within a week, Gorgon organisms were deploying modified versions of the Tau's own toxins against their creators, the compounds altered to specifically target Tau biochemistry. The speed of these adaptations suggested that Gorgon possessed enhanced synaptic processing capabilities or access to a more extensive genetic library than other hive fleets. Adeptus Mechanicus xenobiologists theorized that Gorgon might represent a specialized reconnaissance fleet, designed to rapidly catalog and counter various defensive strategies before larger hive fleet elements arrived. The alternative explanation, that the hive mind had simply refined its adaptive mechanisms through millions of years of consuming different species, proved even more troubling. If Gorgon's capabilities represented the baseline for future Tyranid evolution, the Imperium faced an enemy that could adapt faster than human military doctrine could respond. The Imperial Guard regiments that engaged Gorgon after its conflicts with the Tau-faced organisms adapted to counter human weapons and tactics. The Tyranids deployed against Imperial positions demonstrated resistance to lasgun fire, their carapaces incorporating reflective structures that dissipated laser energy. Explosive ordnance proved more effective initially, but subsequent waves showed enhanced shock absorption capabilities that reduced the effectiveness of fragmentation weapons. The pattern repeated with every weapon system the Guard employed, initial success followed by rapid adaptation that forced constant tactical evolution. Hive Fleet Jormungandr represented a different strategic approach entirely, one that bypassed many conventional defensive advantages through subterranean invasion tactics. This fleet arrived in the Orpheus sector in the early years of the 42nd millennium, its bioships deploying organisms that immediately burrowed into planetary surfaces rather than engaging in surface warfare. The first indication of Jormungandr's presence came when fortified positions began collapsing from beneath, their foundations undermined by extensive tunnel networks that had been excavated without triggering surface sensors. The organisms that composed Jormungandr's vanguard forces showed clear adaptations for underground operations. Their carapaces incorporated sensory organs that functioned through echolocation and seismic detection, allowing them to navigate through solid rock with precision. Specialized bioforms designated as trigons served as living drilling machines, their massive bodies capable of boring through rock at speeds that conventional mining equipment could not match. These creatures created tunnels large enough to accommodate entire swarms, establishing underground highways that connected different invasion sites and allowed Tyranid forces to bypass surface defenses entirely. The fortress world of Shadowbrink demonstrated the effectiveness of Jormungandr's approach and the difficulties Imperial forces faced when fighting enemies that attacked from below. This world's defenses had been designed to repel surface assaults and orbital invasions, with extensive void shield coverage protecting major installations and interlocking fields of fire covering all approach vectors. The Planetary Defense Force had trained for decades to repel attacks from above, their doctrine built around holding fortified positions and calling down orbital fire support on advancing enemies. None of these preparations proved relevant when the Tyranids emerged from beneath their feet. The first attacks came without warning, as Ravenous burst through the floors of command bunkers and supply depots, their surprise assaults eliminating key personnel before defenders could respond. These infiltrator organisms had been specifically adapted for underground movement, their serpentine bodies allowing them to navigate through narrow tunnels and their enhanced sensory organs detecting vibrations from surface activity. They struck at critical infrastructure, power generation facilities, communications hubs, and ammunition storage depots, crippling defensive capabilities before the main Tyranid force revealed its presence. When the primary assault began, it came from dozens of locations simultaneously as trigons erupted from underground, their massive bodies creating openings through which hormagaunts and termagants poured in endless streams. The defenders found themselves fighting on multiple fronts with no clear front line, their carefully prepared defensive positions rendered useless when the enemy appeared behind them. Attempts to collapse the tunnel networks with explosive charges proved ineffective. The Tyranids simply excavated new tunnels around the collapsed sections, their rate of excavation exceeding the defenders' ability to destroy the underground infrastructure. The void shields that protected Shadowbrink's major installations, designed to deflect orbital bombardment and prevent surface penetration, provided no defense against attacks from below. Tyranid organisms emerged inside the shield perimeters, having tunneled beneath the generators and surfaced in supposedly secure areas. The Fortress Monastery of the Marines Errant, a Space Marine chapter maintaining a garrison on Shadowbrink, found itself under siege from within as Tyranids poured through tunnels that honeycombed the structure's foundations. The Marines errant fought room to room through their own fortress, the close confines negating many advantages their power armor and superior training provided. The eventual loss of Shadowbrink forced Imperial strategists to completely reconsider defensive doctrine for worlds threatened by Jormungandr. Traditional fortifications proved worse than useless. They created concentrated targets that the Tyranids could undermine and collapse, killing defenders trapped inside when foundations gave way. The solution required dispersed defensive positions with deep seismic sensors that could detect tunneling activity, combined with rapid response forces capable of engaging Tyranid breaches immediately. This defensive approach demanded resources and training that most Imperial worlds simply did not possess, leaving them vulnerable to Jormungandr's subterranean tactics. Hive Fleet Chronos presented the most anomalous behavior pattern of any Tyranid force encountered by the Imperium, to the point where some within the Ordo Xenos questioned whether it represented a conventional Hive fleet at all. Chronos emerged after the opening of the Great Rift, its tendrils appearing in regions where chaos incursions had created warp storms and demonic manifestations. Rather than targeting Imperial worlds or other conventional sources of biomass, Chronos specifically hunted chaos forces, its organisms attacking demon-infested planets and closing warp rifts through mechanisms that Imperial observers could not adequately explain. The first documented encounter with Chronos occurred in the Vigilus system, where a tendril of the fleet engaged chaos forces that had emerged from the Cicatrix Maledictum. Imperial observers expected the Tyranids to ignore the demons in favor of the substantial human population available on Vigilus itself. Instead, Chronos organisms attacked the chaos positions with single-minded determination, their bioweapons proving surprisingly effective against entities that normally required blessed weapons or psychic attacks to harm. The Tyranids deployed specialized organisms that generated anti-psychic fields, zones of null space that disrupted warp energies and caused demons to lose cohesion. These anti-psychic organisms, including enhanced zoanthropes and new bioforms designated as neurolictors, functioned as psychic predators that hunted entities with strong warp signatures. They moved through battlefields targeting psychers and demonic manifestations specifically, their attacks disrupting the connection between the warp and real space that allowed such beings to exist. Imperial psychers caught in proximity to these creatures reported their powers failing, the connection to the warp becoming muted or severed entirely. For demons, which existed as projections of warp energy into real space, this effect proved catastrophic. They simply ceased to exist when the psychic null field disrupted their manifestation. The strategic implications of Chronos' behavior sparked intense debate within the Inquisition and among the highest levels of Imperial command. Some theorized that the hive mind had recognized chaos as a threat to its consumption of the galaxy, the warp's corrupting influence potentially interfering with the Tyranids' ability to process and utilize biomass from chaos-tainted worlds. This explanation suggested a pragmatic calculation. The hive mind was eliminating a competitor for resources rather than acting as an ally to the Imperium. Alternative theories proposed that Chronos represented an immune response, the hive mind's equivalent of antibodies targeting an infection that threatened the greater organism. The most disturbing hypothesis suggested that the hive mind had begun adapting to consume warp energy itself, developing organisms capable of processing and utilizing the immaterium as an additional resource beyond conventional biomass. If true, this represented an evolutionary leap that would make the Tyranids effectively unstoppable. They would no longer be limited to consuming physical matter, but could feed on the warp itself. The implications extended beyond simple resource acquisition. A hive mind capable of existing partially in the warp might develop capabilities that rivaled or exceeded those of the chaos gods themselves. Regardless of the underlying motivation, Chronos' actions created tactical opportunities that some Imperial commanders attempted to exploit. Several Lord Generals and Space Marine chapter masters coordinated their operations with Chronos' movements, allowing the Tyranids to engage Chaos forces while Imperial troops focused on evacuation or securing strategic objectives. This collaboration remained strictly tactical and temporary. Once Kronos eliminated the Chaos presence, it invariably turned its attention to Imperial forces and conventional biomass sources. The brief respite it provided proved valuable nonetheless, particularly in regions where Chaos incursions had overwhelmed local defenses. The minor Hive fleets and splinter forces beyond these major designations numbered in the dozens, each displaying distinct characteristics that suggested continued hive mind experimentation with invasion strategies. Hive Fleet Hydra adopted a cellular structure where individual splinter fleets operated independently until encountering resistance they could not overcome, at which point they would converge and overwhelm the obstacle through combined strength. This approach made Hydra nearly impossible to track or predict, as its component elements appeared and disappeared across vast regions of space without apparent coordination. Hive Fleet Tiamat demonstrated perhaps the strangest behavior of any Tyranid force, establishing a permanent presence on a single world rather than consuming it and moving on. The fleet seized the planet Xyophoria in the Tiamat system and began constructing a massive organic structure that defied classification. This construction, which Imperial observers designated as the Norn Crown, grew to enormous size over the course of decades, its purpose remaining unclear despite extensive reconnaissance efforts. The structure generated powerful psychic emanations that suggested it might serve as a beacon or communications relay for the hive mind, but its true function remained mysterious. The Tyranids defending the Norn Crown fought with unprecedented ferocity against all attempts to investigate or destroy the structure. Multiple Imperial strike forces, including Space Marine chapter elements and inquisitorial task forces, attempted to penetrate Tiamat's defenses and were repelled with massive casualties. The organisms guarding the construction site included bioforms never observed elsewhere, suggesting that Tiamat had developed or produced specialized defenders specifically for this purpose. The fact that the hive mind devoted substantial resources to protecting a single location rather than continuing its consumption of nearby systems suggested the project held significance that outweighed immediate biomass acquisition. Hive Fleet Moloch appeared in the Segmentum Pacificus, its organisms displaying unusual aggression even by Tyranid standards. Moloch forces attacked with apparent disregard for casualties that would have caused other Hive fleets to adjust their tactics, overwhelming defenders through sheer persistence rather than adaptive strategy. The fleet's bioships showed signs of damage and mutation that suggested exposure to extreme environmental conditions, possibly indicating a journey through regions of space affected by warp storms or other hazards. Despite these apparent handicaps, Moloch successfully consumed several worlds before Imperial forces managed to scatter its tendrils. Hive Fleet Ouroboros demonstrated behavioral patterns that suggested internal conflict or malfunction within the hive mind's control mechanisms. The fleet's organisms occasionally attacked each other, larger bioforms consuming smaller ones, even when Imperial forces presented more logical targets. Some xenobiologists theorized that Ouroboros represented a hive fleet in the process of fragmenting, or one suffering from synaptic degradation. Others proposed that the observed behavior was deliberate, the hive mind recycling damaged or obsolete organisms to recover their biomass for use in creating improved versions. The truth remained unclear, but Ouroboros's unpredictable behavior made it particularly difficult to counter, as standard Tyranid tactical patterns did not reliably predict its actions. The proliferation of these minor hive fleets and countless splinter forces created a strategic nightmare for Imperial military planners. Each required different defensive approaches based on its specific adaptations and behavioral patterns. Forces equipped and trained to fight Jormungandr's subterranean assaults proved ineffective against Gorgon's rapid adaptations or Kronos' anti-psychic organisms. The Imperium lacked the resources to maintain specialized anti-Tyranid forces for every variant, forcing most worlds to rely on generic defensive doctrine that proved inadequate against fleets with specialized capabilities. The systematic methodology by which Tyranid Hive Fleets consume worlds follows patterns that have been observed and documented across hundreds of planetary invasions. Imperial strategists, xenobiologists of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and survivors of Tyranid attacks have contributed to an understanding of the invasion cycle that reveals both the terrifying efficiency of the hive mind and potential vulnerabilities that can be exploited by prepared defenders. The cycle consists of distinct phases, each serving specific purposes in the overall strategy of biomass acquisition and fleet expansion. Understanding these phases has become essential for Imperial forces attempting to defend against or survive Tyranid incursions. The Vanguard phase begins long before the main Hive fleet arrives in a target system, sometimes years or even decades in advance. The hive mind deploys specialized organisms designed for infiltration and reconnaissance, creatures that operate independently of the main swarm while transmitting psychic coordinates back to the approaching fleet. Lictors represent the most commonly encountered Vanguard organisms, their chameleonic carapaces and pheromone trails making them nearly undetectable by standard Imperial auger arrays. These creatures infiltrate populated worlds through various means, stowing away on merchant vessels, landing in remote wilderness regions via small spore pods, or emerging from derelict spacecraft that drift into system peripheries. Once planet-side, lictors begin their work with methodical precision. They stalk and eliminate key personnel, whose deaths will weaken defensive capabilities when the main invasion begins. Planetary governors, senior military officers, tech priests maintaining critical infrastructure, and astropaths capable of calling for reinforcement all become priority targets. The lictors kill with surgical efficiency, their rending claws capable of decapitating a human in a single strike. The bodies often disappear entirely, consumed by the lictor to fuel its continued operations and prevent discovery of the infiltration. Military commanders who survive lictor attacks report the creatures demonstrating intelligence that suggests direct control by the hive mind, adapting their hunting patterns to counter security measures and targeting individuals whose loss will cause maximum disruption. The psychic reconnaissance conducted by lictors serves purposes beyond simple assassination. Each lictor functions as a living beacon, its presence generating weak psychic emissions that the hive mind uses to map the target world's geography, population centers, and defensive capabilities. The creatures position themselves at strategic locations across the planet, creating a psychic coordinate network that guides the eventual mycetic spore deployment with precision. Worlds with multiple lictors operating simultaneously find that the subsequent Tyranid invasion strikes at the most vulnerable points in their defenses, suggesting the hive mind synthesizes information from all its vanguard organisms into comprehensive tactical assessments. Genestealer infiltration represents a more insidious form of vanguard operation, one that can compromise worlds' generations before the hive fleet arrives. These organisms possess intelligence exceeding most Tyranid species, capable of independent operation and long-term planning that spans decades. Genestealers infiltrate worlds by hiding aboard spacecraft, their ability to survive in vacuum and their lack of need for conventional life support making them ideal stowaways. Once aboard a vessel, they seek out isolated crew members and infect them with genetic material through specialized ovipositor organs. The infected individuals, designated as first-generation hybrids, appear superficially human but carry Tyranid genetic sequences that will express in their offspring. The establishment of genestealer cults represents one of the most successful infiltration strategies the hive mind employs. These cults grow slowly over multiple generations, each successive generation of hybrids appearing more human than their parents, until the fourth generation becomes nearly indistinguishable from baseline humans. The cult operates in secret, its members occupying positions throughout planetary society while maintaining hidden worship of the entity they perceive as divine, the Patriarch, the original genestealer that founded the cult. The infected individuals experience powerful psychic compulsions that ensure loyalty to the cult and, by extension, to the approaching hive fleet. By the time the main Hive fleet reaches a world compromised by a genestealer cult, the infestation has typically spread through multiple levels of society. Cult members occupy positions in planetary defense forces, providing intelligence on defensive capabilities and sabotaging equipment at critical moments. Others work in communications facilities, where they can delay or falsify reports of Tyranid approach. Some achieve positions in planetary government, their influence used to redirect resources away from defensive preparations or to create political instability that weakens unified response to the invasion. The most disturbing aspect of cult operations is that the infected genuinely believe they serve a benevolent purpose, their compromised minds interpreting the approaching Tyranid swarm as salvation rather than annihilation. When the main Hive fleet arrives in system, the cult activates in coordination with the initial Tyranid assault. Cult members emerge from hiding and begin attacks on critical infrastructure, their intimate knowledge of planetary defenses allowing them to strike at the most vulnerable points. Power generation facilities explode as cultists sabotage reactors. Void shield generators fail when operators who have been cult members for years input shutdown codes. Ammunition depots detonate, eliminating stockpiles that defenders would have relied upon. The coordination between cult uprising and Tyranid landing creates chaos that multiplies the effectiveness of the invasion, defenders finding themselves fighting enemies both from orbit and within their own cities. The psychic reconnaissance conducted during the Vanguard phase extends beyond simple tactical intelligence gathering. The collective presence of lictors, genestealers, and cult members creates a psychic network that weakens the barrier between real space and the warp in the target system. This degradation facilitates the shadow in the warp effect when the main fleet arrives, the psychic pressure of the hive mind finding a system already compromised and vulnerable to its influence. Astropaths attempting to send distress calls find their messages corrupted or blocked entirely. The psychic static generated by the hive mind's approach overwhelming their ability to reach the astronomican. Navigators guiding reinforcement fleets toward the system report their warp site becoming clouded, the usual reference points obscured by a darkness that seems to actively resist their perception. The main swarm assault begins when the Hive Fleet's bioships achieve orbital superiority or determine that ground forces can be deployed despite ongoing void battles. The deployment method varies based on defensive capabilities and environmental conditions, but mycetic spores remain the most common delivery system. These living drop pods are grown within Hive ships specifically for planetary assault, their exterior shells designed to survive atmospheric entry and anti-aircraft fire while protecting the organisms housed within. The spores incorporate biological systems that allow limited course correction during descent, enabling them to adjust trajectories and strike specific coordinates provided by vanguard organisms already on the surface. The initial spore deployment typically numbers in the millions, a calculated saturation strike designed to overwhelm point defense systems through sheer volume. Orbital defense platforms and ground-based anti-aircraft batteries destroy thousands of spores during the descent, their automated targeting systems, and human operators working at maximum capacity to thin the approaching swarm. The Tyranids accept these losses as inevitable, the cost of delivering ground forces calculated against the biomass that will be gained from successful planetary consumption. Spores that survive the descent impact across the target world's surface, their biological shells cracking open to release the organisms within. The composition of the initial landing forces reflects intelligence gathered during the Vanguard phase and the hive mind's assessment of defensive capabilities. Worlds with extensive fortifications and heavy weapons emplacements face immediate deployment of larger organisms, warriors, carnifexes, and other bioforms capable of engaging hardened positions. Lightly defended agri-worlds or civilian population centers receive overwhelming numbers of smaller organisms, hormigants and termagants whose speed and numbers allow them to overrun dispersed populations before organized resistance can form. The hive mind tailors each assault to exploit specific weaknesses identified through reconnaissance, demonstrating strategic flexibility that rivals the finest human military commanders. Synapse creatures form the backbone of Tyranid ground operations, these specialized organisms extending the hive mind's direct control over the swarms around them. Tyranid warriors serve as the most common synapse nodes, their enhanced neural structures allowing them to coordinate dozens of lesser organisms within a radius of several hundred meters. These creatures stand upright on two legs, their bodies combining the durability of heavy infantry with integrated bioweapons that include bone swords, lash whips, and various ranged options grown directly into their physiology. The warriors move through battlefields directing swarms with precision that suggests conscious tactical thought, though in reality they function as extensions of the hive minds, rather than independent intelligences. The presence of synapse creatures transforms Tyranid swarms from dangerous but manageable threats into coordinated military forces capable of executing complex tactical maneuvers. Lesser organisms within synaptic range respond to threats with perfect coordination, their movements synchronized to exploit weaknesses in defensive positions. Hormagaunts that would normally charge directly at enemies instead use cover and concealment when directed by nearby warriors, their natural aggression channeled into tactically sound approaches. Termagants concentrate their fire on priority targets rather than simply shooting at the nearest enemy, their fleshborers focusing on heavy weapons teams or officers whose elimination will disrupt defensive coordination. The shadow and the warp effect intensifies as more Tyranid organisms land on the target world, the psychic pressure building until it affects even non-psychers. Imperial guardsmen report feeling watched by an intelligence so vast and alien that human minds struggle to comprehend its scale. The sensation manifests as persistent dread, a weight on consciousness that saps morale and makes coordinated defense more difficult. Psychers suffer far worse effects, their connection to the warp becoming a liability as the hive mind's presence drowns out normal psychic perception. Sanctioned psychers attempting to manifest their powers find the warp responding sluggishly or not at all, the energies they normally channel blocked by the overwhelming psychic static of the swarm. Astropaths face the most severe consequences of the shadow and the warp, their specialized training for long-range communication making them particularly vulnerable to the hive mind's psychic pressure. Many go catatonic when the shadow reaches full strength, their minds overwhelmed by the alien consciousness pressing against their thoughts. Others experience psychic feedback that drives them insane, their screams describing an endless hunger that consumes all thought and feeling. The most resilient astropaths can sometimes force messages through the shadow, but the effort typically kills them, their bodies burning out from the strain of pushing psychic communications through the hive mind's interference. The disruption of warp travel around systems under Tyranid assault creates strategic isolation that compounds the tactical challenges defenders face. Navigator houses report that approaching within several light years of major Hive Fleet concentrations becomes increasingly hazardous, the warp currents in these regions becoming turbulent and unpredictable. Ships attempting to transit through affected areas risk emerging far from their intended destinations or suffering catastrophic warp drive failures. Reinforcement fleets dispatched to aid besieged worlds often arrive weeks or months late. If they arrive at all, their journeys extended by the need to navigate around the shadow's influence. This isolation means that worlds under Tyranid attack must rely primarily on whatever forces are already present in system, external aid being unreliable at best and impossible at worst. The numerical superiority of Tyranid forces becomes apparent within days of the initial landing. Hive ships in orbit function as biological factories, constantly processing biomass and generating fresh organisms to reinforce ground operations. Every defender killed in battle represents potential resources for the Tyranids, their bodies recovered by specialized organisms and transported to digestion pools where they are broken down into component nutrients. These nutrients are then absorbed by capillary towers or transported back to orbit, where hive ships convert them into new Tyranid bioforms. The feedback loop creates a situation where successful defensive actions, killing attacking Tyranids, ultimately strengthens the invasion force by providing additional biomass for conversion. The realization that they are feeding the enemy with every casualty inflicted has profound psychological effects on defenders. Imperial Guard regiments trained in conventional warfare find their doctrine becoming counterproductive. The attrition strategies that work against human or orc enemies actively benefiting the Tyranids. Officers must adapt their thinking to account for the fact that victory requires not just killing enemies, but preventing the Tyranids from recovering the biomass of fallen organisms. This necessitates the use of incendiary weapons to destroy Tyranid corpses, the deployment of forces to hold ground and deny the enemy access to fallen bodies, and the grim necessity of cremating their own dead rather than allowing traditional burial or recovery for later interment. The planetary consumption phase begins in earnest once the Tyranids establish sufficient ground presence to start large-scale harvesting operations. Capillary towers represent the most visible component of this process, massive organic structures that descend from orbit or grow from spore pods that impact on the surface. These towers can reach heights of several kilometers, their root systems burrowing deep into planetary crust to access subsurface resources. The towers serve multiple functions in the consumption process, beginning with atmospheric conversion. Specialized organs within the tower structures release spores and biochemical agents that transform the planet's atmosphere into a mixture optimized for Tyranid metabolism while becoming increasingly toxic to native life. The atmospheric changes manifest within days of tower establishment. The sky takes on characteristic purple-green coloration as the spores spread through the upper atmosphere, sunlight filtering through the contaminated air with a sickly hue that affects visibility and morale. Unprotected humans begin experiencing respiratory problems as the oxygen content decreases and toxic compounds increase. Plant life starts dying as the altered atmospheric composition prevents normal photosynthesis, forests and agricultural fields withering within weeks. Water sources become contaminated as the biochemical agents dissolve into precipitation, the rain itself becoming mildly corrosive and unsafe for consumption. The transformation proceeds with inexorable efficiency, the Tyranids converting the entire planetary ecosystem into an environment hostile to native life while ideal for their own organisms. Ripper swarms form the foundation of the biomass harvesting operation, these small organisms appearing in numbers that defy comprehension once the main consumption phase begins. Individual rippers stand little more than half a meter tall, their bodies consisting primarily of oversized jaws capable of consuming organic matter at remarkable rates. What makes them truly dangerous is their numbers. Ripper swarms can include millions or billions of individual organisms, moving across planetary surfaces like living carpets that devour everything in their path. They consume plant matter, animal life, human remains, and even each other when other food sources become scarce. Their digestive systems break down organic compounds with extreme efficiency, the processed biomass stored in specialized organs that swell until the rippers become too engorged to move. Larger Tyranid organisms collect these engorged rippers and transport them to digestion pools, organic structures that have grown in areas secured by Tyranid forces. The pools themselves are horrifying to witness, vast pits lined with digestive acids and enzymes that break down any organic matter introduced into them. The rippers are dumped into these pools, along with any other biomass the Tyranids have collected, including the bodies of defenders killed in battle, captured civilians, and native fauna. The pools process this material into a nutrient-rich slurry that capillary towers absorb through root systems, or that smaller organisms transport back to orbit in specialized biocontainers. The efficiency of the consumption process becomes apparent when examining worlds that have undergone complete Tyranid harvesting. Every scrap of organic matter disappears, forests reduced to bare rock, oceans drained and their marine life consumed, soil stripped of the microorganisms that normally inhabit it. The Tyranids harvest atmospheric gases, particularly oxygen and nitrogen, storing these in specialized organisms or processing them into compounds useful for bioship operations. Even the planet's electromagnetic field can be affected as the Tyranids extract metallic elements from the crust, mining operations conducted by specialized boring organisms that tunnel through rock to access mineral deposits. The timeframe for complete planetary consumption varies based on world size, population, and the strength of the Hive fleet conducting the harvest. Smaller worlds with limited populations can be stripped clean in weeks, while heavily populated Hive worlds might resist for months before falling to complete consumption. The presence of organized military resistance extends the timeline, forcing the Tyranids to commit resources to combat operations rather than pure harvesting. However, the outcome remains inevitable unless external intervention arrives. The Tyranids possess effectively unlimited patience and the capacity to adapt to any defensive strategy given sufficient time. Hive ships orbiting consumed worlds swell with absorbed biomass, their internal chambers filling with genetic material and nutrients that will fuel the creation of new organisms. The ships themselves grow larger during extended consumption operations, their biological structures expanding to accommodate increased resource storage. This growth allows individual Hive ships to spawn additional bioships, the fleet literally reproducing itself through the consumption of planetary resources. A Hive fleet that successfully consumes a heavily populated world can emerge from the operation significantly larger than when it arrived. The biomass of billions of humans and their planet's entire ecosystem converted into additional Tyranid forces. The genetic information processing that occurs within Hive ships represents one of the Hive mind's most sophisticated capabilities. Every organism consumed by the Tyranids has its genetic code analyzed and cataloged, useful sequences identified and stored for potential incorporation into future bioforms. This process allows the Hive mind to continuously expand its genetic library, accumulating biological innovations from every species it encounters. Particularly valuable genetic traits, enhanced musculature from one species, toxin resistance from another, specialized sensory organs from a third, can be combined in new organisms that incorporate the best features of multiple sources. The adaptation and spawning of new bioforms proceeds based on tactical requirements identified during ongoing operations. If defenders deploy weapons that prove particularly effective against current Tyranid organisms, the Hive ships begin producing modified versions with enhanced resistance to those specific threats. The process operates on timeframes that human military logistics cannot match, where the Imperium requires months or years to design, test, and deploy new equipment. The Tyranids can produce adapted organisms within days or weeks. This disparity in adaptation speed forces Imperial commanders to constantly evolve their tactics, knowing that any successful strategy will be countered in the next engagement. Fleet movement patterns reflect the Hive mind's strategic calculations regarding biomass availability and resistance levels. Tendrils that encounter heavily defended worlds with organized Space Marine or Imperial Guard resistance may redirect toward less defended targets, the Hive mind determining that the biomass gained from easier conquests outweighs the losses that would be sustained fighting through prepared defenses. This behavior demonstrates that despite their alien nature, the Tyranids operate according to rational cost-benefit analysis, prioritizing efficiency in biomass acquisition over mindless aggression. The coordination between separate tendril fleets suggests the Hive mind maintains awareness of operations across vast distances, though the mechanisms enabling this remain poorly understood. Tendril fleets operating light years apart demonstrate synchronized strategic adjustments that suggest shared intelligence, their movements coordinating to envelope defended regions or converge on particularly valuable targets. This coordination operates despite the shadow in the warp disrupting conventional psychic communication, implying the Hive mind utilizes aspects of the warp that human psychers cannot access or comprehend. The redirection of tendrils based on resistance creates strategic dilemmas for Imperial commanders. Heavily fortifying worlds can cause Tyranid forces to seek easier targets, potentially saving the fortified position but dooming neighboring systems. Alternatively, spreading defensive resources across multiple worlds prevents the Tyranids from finding easy conquests, but risks creating situations where no world possesses sufficient strength to resist determined assault. The hive mind exploits these strategic contradictions, probing defenses and flowing around strong points like water, finding paths of least resistance, always seeking the most efficient route to maximum biomass acquisition. The Tyranid swarm functions as a living weapons system, where each organism fulfills a specific battlefield role, their forms optimized through millions of years of genetic refinement and adaptation. The hive mind deploys these creatures in combinations calculated to overwhelm whatever resistance they encounter, each bioform contributing to the overall tactical picture in ways that demonstrate sophisticated military planning despite their alien nature. Understanding the capabilities and purposes of individual Tyranid organisms provides crucial intelligence for Imperial forces attempting to counter their assaults, though the hive mind's capacity for rapid adaptation means that knowledge gained in one engagement may prove obsolete in the next. Synapse creatures represent the nervous system of the Tyranid swarm, their enhanced neural structures allowing them to channel the hive mind's consciousness and extend its direct control across the battlefield. Without these coordinator organisms, the lesser Tyranid bioforms revert to base instincts, becoming disorganized and significantly less effective. The destruction of synapse creatures therefore becomes a priority for Imperial forces, though accomplishing this requires engaging some of the most dangerous organisms the Tyranids deploy. Hive tyrants stand as the apex synapse creatures, towering organisms that combine devastating combat capabilities with command functions that make them the equivalent of Tyranid generals. These creatures reach heights exceeding 4 meters, their bodies incorporating the most sophisticated biological weapons systems the hive mind produces. Each hive tyrant is unique, its specific configuration adapted to the tactical requirements of its deployment. Some carry massive bone swords capable of cleaving through power armor, while others integrate ranged bioweapons that fire concentrated streams of bioplasma or launch swarms of flesh-boring beetles. The creatures possess intelligence that approaches sentience, though they remain extensions of the hive mind rather than independent beings. The synapse range of a hive tyrant extends for over a kilometer, allowing a single creature to coordinate thousands of lesser organisms across a substantial battlefield area. Imperial forces engaging Tyranid swarms have observed dramatic shifts in enemy behavior when hive tyrants enter combat zones. Disorganized hormigaunt packs suddenly execute flanking maneuvers with military precision. Termagant swarms that had been firing randomly begin concentrating their volleys on priority targets. The entire character of the Tyranid assault changes, transforming from a bestial charge into a coordinated military operation that exploits weaknesses in defensive positions with calculated efficiency. The combat capabilities of hive tyrants make them extraordinarily difficult to eliminate despite their importance as command nodes. Their chitinous armor plates can withstand sustained heavy weapons fire, the layered carapace incorporating shock-absorbing structures that dissipate kinetic energy. Regenerative abilities allow them to recover from wounds that would kill lesser organisms, their bodies rapidly sealing breaches and regrowing damaged tissue. Space Marine Terminators engaging hive tyrants in close combat report battles, lasting minutes rather than the seconds typical for most Tyranid organisms, the creatures matching even enhanced Astartes warriors in strength and ferocity, while possessing reach advantages from their greater size and additional limbs. Some hive tyrants develop psychic capabilities that rival sanctioned Imperial psychers, these specimens designated as hive tyrant psychers by ordo-xenobiologists. These creatures channel the hive mind's psychic power directly, manifesting abilities that include telekinetic strikes capable of crushing battle tanks, psychic screams that rupture blood vessels in unprotected humans, and the ability to dominate weak-willed individuals and turn them against their comrades. The psychic signature of these organisms burns so brightly in the warp that Imperial psychers can detect their presence from kilometers away, though this awareness provides little comfort given the difficulty of actually killing such creatures. Tyranid warriors form the backbone of synapse coordination, these organisms appearing in every major Tyranid assault in numbers that allow them to maintain control over swarms even when hive tyrants are eliminated. Warriors stand approximately 3 meters tall, their upright posture and multiple limbs giving them superficial resemblance to human infantry, though their alien nature remains unmistakable. Each warrior carries integrated bioweapons that include close combat options like bone swords and lash whips, alongside ranged weapons such as devourers or death spitters. The creatures move with predatory grace despite their size, capable of rapid sprints that allow them to close with enemies or reposition to threatened sectors. The synapse range of individual warriors extends approximately 200 meters, sufficient to coordinate the organisms in their immediate vicinity, but requiring multiple warriors to maintain control over larger formations. Tyranid assaults typically deploy warriors throughout the swarm rather than concentrating them, this distribution ensuring that the loss of individual synapse creatures does not create gaps in coordination. Imperial forces that successfully eliminate warriors in one sector often find that nearby warriors shift position to cover the gap, maintaining synaptic coverage even as casualties mount. The tactical flexibility this provides makes disrupting Tyranid coordination significantly more difficult than simply killing synapse creatures would suggest. Warriors demonstrate combat effectiveness that exceeds most Imperial infantry equivalents, their enhanced strength allowing them to tear through flak armor with their bare talons, while their ranged weapons fire living ammunition capable of penetrating light vehicle armor. Veteran Imperial Guard sergeants report that warriors coordinate their attacks with precision that suggests military training, though in reality, they simply channel the hive mind's accumulated tactical knowledge from millions of previous battles. Warriors use cover when available, concentrate fire on heavy weapons teams, and execute flanking maneuvers that would credit human special forces units. Their ability to function as both command nodes and effective combatants makes them priority targets that nonetheless require significant firepower to eliminate. Tyranid primes represent an evolutionary step between warriors and hive tyrants, creatures that combine enhanced combat capabilities with extended synapse range and improved coordination abilities. These organisms stand slightly taller than standard warriors, their bodies incorporating additional armor plating and more sophisticated bioweapons. Primes typically lead warrior broods, their presence enhancing the effectiveness of surrounding synapse creatures and allowing more complex tactical coordination. The relationship between primes and the warriors they lead suggests a hierarchical command structure, though all remain ultimately subservient to the hive mind's overarching consciousness. The appearance of primes in Tyranid assault forces indicates significant hive fleet commitment to a particular operation, these organisms being produced in smaller numbers than standard warriors, but deployed when the hive mind determines that enhanced coordination justifies the additional biomass investment. Imperial forces engaging prime-led warrior formations report encountering more sophisticated tactics than typical Tyranid assaults display. The warriors execute coordinated fire and movement drills, suppress enemy positions while other elements maneuver, and adapt to changing battlefield conditions with speed that suggests real-time tactical analysis. While the hive mind ultimately directs these actions, the primes serve as crucial relay nodes that translate strategic intent into tactical execution. Monstrous creatures form the heavy assault elements of Tyranid swarms, organisms designed to break through fortified positions and provide overwhelming firepower that lesser bioforms cannot match. These creatures represent substantial biomass investments by the hive mind, their production requiring resources equivalent to hundreds of smaller organisms. Their deployment indicates targets the hive mind considers sufficiently valuable to justify the expenditure, typically heavily defended positions or concentrations of enemy armor that standard swarm tactics cannot efficiently overcome. Carnifexes epitomize the Tyranid approach to creating living battle tanks, massive organisms that combine extreme durability with devastating close combat capabilities. These creatures can exceed 4 meters in height and weigh several tons, their bodies covered in chitinous armor plates thick enough to deflect all but the heaviest anti-tank weapons. The standard Carnifex configuration includes massive crushing claws capable of tearing through vehicle armor and scything talons that can disembowel infantry with single strikes. Their bulk allows them to simply trample lighter enemies, crushing defenders beneath their weight as they charge through defensive lines. The psychological impact of Carnifex charges cannot be understated. Imperial guardsmen watching these monsters approach report overwhelming fear, the sight of multi-ton creatures thundering toward their positions triggering primal terror responses that training struggles to overcome. The ground shakes with each step, and the creatures' roars, bioacoustic weapons designed to disorient prey, cause physical pain in unprotected humans. Defensive lines that would hold against human or orc assaults break when Carnifexes reach them, soldiers fleeing rather than standing to face creatures that seem unstoppable. Only the discipline of veteran units or the presence of space marines prevents complete routes when these organisms enter battle. The adaptability of Carnifex bioforms allows the hive mind to produce variants optimized for specific tactical requirements. Some Carnifexes carry enhanced sensory organs that allow them to detect enemies through walls or underground, making them ideal for urban combat or fighting enemies using stealth tactics. Others integrate ranged bioweapons, their bodies mounting heavy venom cannons or devourers that provide fire support while maintaining their close combat threat. The Old One Eye, a legendary Carnifex that has survived multiple engagements across different worlds, demonstrates the upper limits of the organism's combat potential. This creature regenerates from wounds that would kill standard Carnifexes and displays tactical intelligence that suggests direct hive mind control. Tyrannofexes represent the Tyranid answer to Imperial artillery and heavy armor, organisms that sacrifice mobility for overwhelming firepower and defensive capabilities. These creatures dwarf even Carnifexes, their bodies incorporating armor plating so thick that lascannon strikes sometimes fail to penetrate to vital organs. The primary weapon system integrated into Tyrannofex bioforms varies, but common configurations include rupture cannons that fire massive bioprojectiles capable of destroying bunkers, acid sprays that melt through vehicle armor, and fleshborer hives that release swarms of flesh-eating beetles. The creatures move slowly compared to other Tyranid organisms, but their role as mobile weapons platforms makes speed less critical than firepower and survivability. Imperial armor crews engaging Tyrannofexes report frustration at the difficulty of achieving killing hits on these organisms. Battle tank main guns that would destroy enemy vehicles with single shots require multiple direct hits to bring down a Tyrannofex, and even then the creature often continues functioning long enough to return fire. The organism's regenerative abilities allow them to recover from damage between engagements, wounds that would permanently disable conventional vehicles healing within hours, as the Tyrannofex's biology repairs damaged systems. This durability makes them persistent threats that continue operating throughout extended campaigns, their presence forcing Imperial forces to maintain anti-armor capabilities even after initial Tyranid waves have been repelled. Exocrines fill an artillery role within Tyranid swarms, creatures that deploy bioplasma weapons capable of engaging targets at extreme ranges with devastating accuracy. The exocrine's primary weapon generates superheated plasma through biological processes, the creature's body serving as both power source and targeting system for the integrated weapon. This bioplasma can melt through ceramite armor, incinerate infantry squads, and destroy light vehicles with single shots. The creature's sensory organs provide targeting data that rivals Imperial fire control systems, allowing it to engage enemies at ranges exceeding a kilometer with accuracy that makes counter-battery fire extremely hazardous. The tactical flexibility exocrines provide allows Tyranid swarms to suppress enemy heavy weapons and eliminate targets that would otherwise threaten synapse creatures or monstrous organisms. Imperial forces establishing firing positions find themselves targeted by exocrine plasma before they can bring their own weapons to bear, the creatures prioritizing threats to the swarm's coordination and heavy assault elements. The exocrine's ability to rapidly shift targets makes it particularly dangerous in fluid battlefield situations, the creature responding to changing tactical conditions by redirecting its fire to wherever the hive mind determines it will prove most effective. Haruspexes represent specialized assault organisms designed for close combat in confined spaces and the consumption of heavily armored targets. These creatures feature massive crushing jaws capable of biting through plasteel and ceramite, their digestive systems able to process even inorganic materials to extract any available nutrients. The Haruspex's body incorporates grasping limbs that pull enemies toward its mouth, the creature literally devouring its victims during combat. Imperial forces engaging Haruspexes in urban environments or aboard spacecraft report the creatures methodically working through defensive positions, consuming defenders and using their bulk to block corridors and prevent retreat. The regenerative capabilities of Haruspexes exceed those of most other Tyranid organisms, the creatures able to heal wounds by consuming biomass during battle. A Haruspex that kills and devours an enemy rapidly metabolizes the consumed material, using it to repair damage and fuel continued combat operations. This creates a feedback loop where the creature becomes more dangerous the longer it fights, its combat effectiveness actually increasing as it consumes more victims. Imperial tactical doctrine recommends eliminating Haruspexes quickly with overwhelming firepower, rather than engaging them in extended combat, where their regenerative abilities provide cumulative advantages. The swarm organisms that form the bulk of Tyranid assault forces represent the endless tide that defines the species' tactical approach. These creatures are produced in staggering numbers, their individual value to the hive mind being minimal, but their collective impact overwhelming defensive positions through sheer mass. The biomass investment required to produce swarm organisms is minimal compared to larger bioforms, allowing hive fleets to generate millions of these creatures from the resources that would produce thousands of warriors or hundreds of monstrous organisms. Hormagaunts embody the Tyranid philosophy of overwhelming enemies through speed and numbers. These creatures stand approximately human height, but move on 4 legs that allow them to achieve sprinting speeds exceeding what unaugmented humans can match. Their primary weapons are scything talons, blade-like appendages that extend from their forelimbs and can disembowel victims with slashing attacks. Hormagaunts attack in waves that can number in the thousands, their charges creating walls of chitin and talons that crash into defensive positions with the force of living avalanches. The adrenal glands that Hormagaunts possess drive them into frenzied states during combat, the biochemical stimulation making them nearly fearless and increasing their already impressive speed. Imperial guardsmen facing Hormagaunt charges report the creatures moving so fast that targeting them becomes extremely difficult, the organisms zigzagging and leaping to avoid fire while closing the distance to melee range. Once they reach defensive lines, the Hormagaunts use their numbers to overwhelm defenders, multiple creatures attacking single targets, and using their mass to drag down enemies even when individual Hormagaunts are killed. The tactical role of Hormagaunts involves tying down enemy forces and creating opportunities for other Tyranid organisms to exploit. While defenders focus on the immediate threat of Hormagaunts tearing through their lines, warriors and larger bioforms maneuver into advantageous positions or synapse creatures coordinate flanking attacks. The Hormagaunts themselves are expendable from the hive mind's perspective, their death serving tactical purposes even when they fail to eliminate significant numbers of enemies. Every defender occupied with fighting Hormagaunts is a defender not shooting at more valuable Tyranid organisms, and every ammunition magazine expended on swarm creatures is ammunition unavailable for engaging synapse creatures or monstrous bioforms. Termagants provide the Tyranid swarm with basic ranged firepower, creatures that fill roles similar to Imperial infantry, while costing the hive mind minimal resources to produce. These organisms stand roughly human height and carry bioweapons integrated into their bodies, typically flesh borers that fire beetle-like projectiles capable of burrowing into targets and consuming them from within. Termagants deploy in swarms that can number in the tens of thousands, their combined firepower creating storms of bioprojectiles that saturate defensive positions and make movement across open ground suicidal for unarmored infantry. The effectiveness of individual termagants remains limited, their fleshborers struggling to penetrate heavy armor, and their physical fragility making them vulnerable to even lasgun fire. However, the hive mind deploys them in such overwhelming numbers that their individual weaknesses become irrelevant. A single termagant poses minimal threat to a space marine, but 100 termagants firing simultaneously can bring down even power armored warriors through accumulated damage. The creatures advance in waves, each wave absorbing defensive fire and allowing subsequent waves to close the distance, until eventually the sheer mass of organisms overwhelms defensive capabilities. The presence of synapse creatures dramatically enhances termagant effectiveness, transforming them from mindless shooters into coordinated fire teams. Under synaptic control, termagants concentrate their fire on priority targets, use available cover, and execute tactical maneuvers that maximize their effectiveness while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. Imperial forces engaging synapse-controlled termagants report facing enemies that fight with discipline rivaling trained human soldiers. The creature's natural advantages in numbers and fearlessness, combining with tactical competence to create dangerous opponents. Gargoyles extend the Tyranid threat into the third dimension, flying organisms that combine aerial mobility with the same swarming tactics their ground-based cousins employ. These creatures possess leathery wings that allow them to achieve flight through a combination of muscle power and lighter-than-air gases generated in specialized organs. Gargoyles carry fleshborers similar to termagants, but can attack from angles that ground-based defenders struggle to cover, diving from above or circling around defensive positions to strike at vulnerable rear areas. The psychological impact of gargoyle attacks compounds their tactical effectiveness. Defenders accustomed to threats approaching from ground level find themselves vulnerable to attacks from above, the creature's mobility allowing them to bypass obstacles and fortifications that would stop ground-based organisms. The distinctive screeching sounds gargoyles make during attack runs trigger instinctive fear responses, the high-pitched calls designed to disorient prey and disrupt coordinated defensive fire. Imperial forces engaging gargoyle swarms report the creatures blocking out the sky, their numbers so vast that they literally darken the battlefield as they descend. The specialized bioforms that round out Tyranid assault forces fulfill roles that require capabilities beyond what standard swarm organisms or monstrous creatures provide. These organisms represent the hive mind's solutions to specific tactical challenges, creatures designed to counter particular defensive strategies or exploit specific vulnerabilities in enemy forces. Their presence in Tyranid swarms indicates sophisticated strategic planning, the hive mind deploying these specialized tools when standard assault tactics prove insufficient. Lictors function as the Tyranid equivalent of special forces operatives, creatures designed for independent operation behind enemy lines and the elimination of high-value targets. These organisms possess chameleonic carapaces that allow them to blend into their surroundings with effectiveness that renders them nearly invisible to standard visual detection. Their sensory organs can detect prey through walls and track targets by following pheromone trails that persist for days. The creatures move with absolute silence despite their size, their bodies incorporating sound-dampening structures that muffle even the impacts of their footfalls on hard surfaces. The combat capabilities of lictors focus on assassination rather than sustained fighting. Their rending claws can decapitate humans with single strikes, and their flesh hooks, barbed projectiles that launch from specialized organs, allow them to eliminate targets at range before closing for melee combat. Lictors typically operate alone or in small groups, stalking priority targets and eliminating them before vanishing back into concealment. Imperial officers who survive lictor attacks report the creatures demonstrating intelligence that suggests direct hive mind control, the organisms adapting their hunting patterns to counter security measures and persistently pursuing targets across multiple locations. Genestealers represent perhaps the most insidious Tyranid organism, creatures that combine lethal close combat capabilities with the ability to establish long-term infiltrations that compromise entire worlds. These organisms possess 4 arms ending in rending claws capable of tearing through power armor, their strength exceeding what their relatively compact frames would suggest. Genestealers move with blinding speed, their reflexes allowing them to dodge incoming fire and close with enemies before defenders can bring weapons to bear. In close combat, they are devastating, their multiple limbs striking from different angles simultaneously, and their claws finding weak points in armor with precision that suggests supernatural awareness. The infiltration capabilities of Genestealers extend beyond simple stealth. These creatures can survive in vacuum and extreme temperatures, making them ideal for stowing away aboard spacecraft or hiding in hostile environments that would kill most organisms. Their intelligence exceeds that of standard Tyranid bioforms, allowing them to plan long-term operations and establish cult networks that persist for generations. The ovipositor organs Genestealers use to infect victims inject genetic material that transforms the victim into a hybrid creature loyal to the Tyranid cause, creating infiltration networks that spread through populations like diseases. Venomthropes provide area denial capabilities through the toxic spore clouds they generate, creatures that transform battlefields into hazardous environments where unprotected infantry cannot survive. These organisms float above the ground through gas-filled sacs, their bodies constantly releasing clouds of poisonous spores that cause respiratory failure in humans and corrode equipment exposed to them. The spore clouds persist for hours after venomthropes pass through an area, creating zones that Imperial forces must avoid or traverse only with sealed armor and respirators. The creatures often accompany Tyranid advances, their spore clouds obscuring visibility and forcing defenders to engage enemies they can barely see while suffering the effects of the toxic atmosphere. Zoanthropes fulfill psychic warfare roles within Tyranid swarms, creatures that channel the hive mind's psychic power into devastating attacks that bypass physical defenses. These organisms possess enlarged craniums housing enhanced neural structures, their bodies atrophied to the point where they float through psychic levitation rather than walking. The psychic abilities zoanthropes manifest include warp blasts that can melt through vehicle armor, psychic shields that deflect incoming fire, and the ability to disrupt enemy psykers through psychic interference. Imperial psykers engaging zoanthropes report the creature's channeling power that exceeds what individual human psykers can safely manifest, the zoanthropes drawing directly on the hive mind's vast psychic reservoir. The synapse capabilities of zoanthropes combine with their psychic powers to make them priority targets that nonetheless prove extremely difficult to eliminate. Their psychic shields can deflect weapons fire that would destroy other synapse creatures, requiring concentrated fire or specialized anti-psyker weapons to penetrate. The hive mind represents a form of consciousness so alien to human experience that even the most learned xenobiologists struggle to comprehend its nature. Unlike any intelligence humanity has encountered, the hive mind exists as a singular awareness distributed across billions of individual organisms, each creature functioning as a neuron within a vast psychic network that spans light years. This Gestalt consciousness eliminates individual thought entirely. No Tyranid organism possesses self-awareness, personal desires, or survival instinct in any recognizable sense. Each creature exists solely as an extension of the greater whole, its actions determined by the collective intelligence that perceives the galaxy through trillions of sensory organs and processes tactical information with computational capacity that dwarfs the most sophisticated cogitator Res the Mechanicus has ever constructed. The implications of this distributed consciousness become apparent when examining Tyranid battlefield coordination. Where human armies require complex command hierarchies, communication networks, and officers to interpret orders and adapt them to local conditions, the Tyranid swarm operates with perfect synchronization. Every organism receives tactical instructions instantaneously through the psychic network, their responses coordinated down to the individual creature, without the delays inherent in conventional command structures. A hormigaunt on one flank reacts to developments occurring kilometers away on the opposite flank without requiring messengers or Vox transmissions. Synapse creatures adjust their positions to maintain optimal coverage without explicit orders. The entire swarm functions as a single organism, despite consisting of millions of separate bodies, each component working toward objectives that serve the hive mind's overarching strategy. This perfect coordination creates tactical advantages that human commanders cannot replicate. Tyranid forces execute flanking maneuvers that require precise timing across multiple units, the organisms moving into positions simultaneously and attacking at the exact moment when their combined assault achieves maximum effect. Feints and diversionary attacks occur naturally as the hive mind directs portions of the swarm to engage defenders, while other elements maneuver into advantageous positions. The swarm adapts to changing battlefield conditions in real time, organisms shifting roles and adjusting tactics without the confusion or delay that affects human forces when plans change mid-battle. Imperial Guard officers report facing enemies that seem to anticipate their responses, the Tyranids adjusting their approach based on defensive reactions with speed that suggests they are fighting a single opponent rather than coordinating multiple units. The shadow in the warp phenomenon represents the most tangible manifestation of the hive mind's presence, a psychic pressure that blankets regions of space where Tyranid forces concentrate in sufficient numbers. This effect extends for dozens of light years around major hive fleet concentrations, creating zones where the normal relationship between real space and the warp becomes distorted. The shadow manifests differently depending on the observer's psychic sensitivity, but all reports describe it as fundamentally oppressive, a smothering darkness that presses against consciousness and makes thought itself more difficult. For psychers, the shadow in the warp transforms from uncomfortable to catastrophic. Sanctioned psychers attempting to manifest their powers within the shadow report their connection to the warp becoming clouded, the energies they normally channel responding sluggishly or not at all. The psychic presence of the hive mind drowns out their own consciousness, its vast alien awareness overwhelming their ability to focus and shape warp energy. Astropaths suffer the worst effects, their specialized training for long-range psychic communication making them particularly vulnerable. Many go catatonic when the shadow reaches full intensity, their minds unable to process the scale of the intelligence pressing against their thoughts. Others experience psychic feedback that drives them insane, their screams describing an endless hunger that consumes all sensation and thought. The effect on warp travel proves equally severe. Navigators guiding vessels through the immaterium report their warp site becoming obscured when approaching regions affected by the shadow, the reference points they normally use to plot courses disappearing behind a psychic darkness that resists all attempts at penetration. The Astronomican's light, that crucial beacon which allows warp navigation across the Imperium, becomes dim or invisible within the shadow's influence. Ships attempting to transit through affected regions risk emerging far from their intended destinations, the distorted warp currents making accurate navigation nearly impossible. Some vessels disappear entirely, lost in the warp when their navigators lose all reference points and cannot find their way back to real space. The question of whether the shadow represents a defensive adaptation or an inherent aspect of Tyranid nature has generated extensive debate among Imperial scholars. Some xenobiologists theorize that the hive mind developed this capability specifically to counter psychic threats, the shadow serving as a form of psychic camouflage that conceals Tyranid fleet movements and prevents enemy psychers from targeting the swarm with warp-based attacks. This interpretation suggests deliberate evolution, the hive mind recognizing psychic powers as threats and adapting to neutralize them. Evidence supporting this theory includes observations that the shadow's intensity increases when Tyranid forces encounter heavy psyker presence, suggesting the hive mind can modulate the effect based on tactical requirements. Alternative theories propose that the shadow represents an unavoidable consequence of the hive mind's existence rather than a designed capability. The sheer psychic mass of billions of organisms linked through a gestalt consciousness would naturally create distortions in the warp, much as physical mass distorts real space. Under this model, the shadow is not a weapon but a side effect, the hive mind's presence in the warp being so overwhelming that it displaces other psychic phenomena through simple magnitude. The fact that the shadow affects chaos entities and demons as severely as it affects Imperial psychers supports this interpretation. If the shadow were designed as a weapon, it would likely target specific threats rather than indiscriminately disrupting all warp-based phenomena. The shadow's effect on chaos forces provides some of the most compelling evidence for understanding its nature. Demons attempting to manifest in regions affected by the shadow find their connection to the warp disrupted, the psychic pressure of the hive mind making it difficult or impossible for warp entities to maintain cohesion in real space. Chaos sorcerers report their powers failing when Tyranid forces approach, the shadow overwhelming their ability to channel the ruinous powers. This mutual antagonism between the hive mind and chaos suggests fundamental incompatibility between the two forces, their presences in the warp conflicting in ways that prevent effective coexistence. Some radical inquisitors within the Ordo Malleus have theorized that the shadow in the warp represents the hive mind actively consuming psychic energy, the gestalt consciousness feeding on the warp itself, much as individual Tyranid organisms consume physical biomass. This hypothesis proposes that the hive mind exists partially in the immaterium, its consciousness spanning both real space and the warp in ways that allow it to process and utilize psychic energy as a resource. If accurate, this theory would explain why the shadow disrupts other warp phenomena. The hive mind is literally devouring the psychic energy that would normally be available for other entities to access. The implications extend beyond simple tactical considerations. A consciousness capable of consuming the warp itself would represent a threat to the fundamental nature of reality in ways that exceed even the dangers posed by chaos. The synaptic control network that enables the hive mind to coordinate its swarms operates through specialized organisms that serve as psychic relay nodes. These synapse creatures extend the hive mind's direct control across the battlefield, creating zones where lesser organisms function under the gestalt consciousness's immediate direction. The hierarchical nature of this command structure becomes apparent when examining how different synapse creatures interact and the ranges over which they can maintain control. Hive tyrants project synaptic influence over areas exceeding a kilometer in radius, their enhanced neural structures allowing them to coordinate thousands of organisms simultaneously. Tyranid warriors maintain control over smaller zones, typically a few hundred meters, but deploy in greater numbers to ensure comprehensive coverage across the swarm's operational area. The relationship between synapse creatures creates a redundant network where the loss of individual nodes does not necessarily disrupt overall coordination. When a hive tyrant falls in battle, nearby warriors automatically extend their synaptic coverage to compensate, maintaining control over organisms that would otherwise revert to instinctive behavior. This redundancy makes disrupting Tyranid coordination significantly more difficult than simply eliminating visible command organisms. Imperial forces must destroy multiple synapse creatures in rapid succession to create gaps in the synaptic network, and even then the hive mind typically responds by redirecting additional synapse creatures to restore coverage before lesser organisms can become completely disorganized. What occurs when synapse creatures are eliminated reveals crucial information about the nature of individual Tyranid organisms and their relationship to the hive mind. Lesser bioforms like hormigants and termagants that lose synaptic connection immediately revert to base instincts, their behavior becoming animalistic rather than tactically coordinated. These creatures continue attacking nearby enemies, but lose the sophisticated tactical awareness that makes them dangerous under synapse control. They no longer use cover effectively, fail to concentrate fire on priority targets, and become vulnerable to tactics that would not work against synapse-controlled organisms. However, their base instincts remain oriented toward aggression and feeding, making them dangerous even in their degraded state. The distance lesser organisms can operate from synapse creatures before reverting to instinct varies based on the specific bioform and the strength of the synaptic connection. Hormigons, with their limited neural capacity, require nearly constant synaptic presence to maintain coordination. Termagants can operate at slightly greater distances from synapse creatures before losing coherence. More sophisticated organisms like genestealers demonstrate greater independence, their enhanced neural structures allowing them to function effectively even when separated from the main swarm for extended periods. This variation suggests that the hive mind can produce organisms with different degrees of autonomy based on their intended roles. Creatures designed for independent operation, receiving more sophisticated neural architecture than those meant to function only as components of larger swarms. The question of Tyranid intelligence and whether the hive mind possesses something analogous to human emotion or motivation represents one of the most debated topics in xenobiological research. The hive mind clearly demonstrates strategic learning, its tactics evolving based on previous encounters and adapting to counter-defensive strategies that proved effective in earlier engagements. This learning occurs across the entire species. Lessons learned by one hive fleet become available to others despite the vast distances separating them, suggesting some form of information transfer that operates beyond conventional psychic communication. The speed and sophistication of this learning process indicates intelligence that rivals or exceeds human strategic planning capabilities. However, whether this intelligence includes anything resembling consciousness in human terms remains unclear. The hive mind makes decisions that appear rational when analyzed through the lens of resource optimization and tactical efficiency, but these decisions might emerge from purely mechanical processes rather than conscious thought. An organism that exists as a distributed network of billions of components might process information and reach conclusions without experiencing anything analogous to human awareness. The hive mind could be simultaneously intelligent and unconscious, its actions resulting from complex information processing rather than deliberate choice. The question of motivation proves equally problematic. The hive mind's behavior appears entirely focused on consumption and expansion, every action ultimately serving the goal of acquiring biomass and producing more Tyranid organisms. This single-minded focus suggests purpose, but whether that purpose emerges from something analogous to desire or simply represents the execution of fundamental programming remains unknown. Human observers tend to anthropomorphize the hive mind, attributing to it hunger, aggression, or other emotions that might not exist in any meaningful sense. The Tyranids consume everything they encounter, but this behavior might be no more emotional than water flowing downhill, a natural process following inevitable patterns rather than conscious choice. Some xenobiologists argue that the scale of the hive mind's operations indicates conscious purpose that transcends simple programming. The coordination required to direct multiple hive fleets across galactic distances, adapt to countless different defensive strategies, and continuously refine biological designs suggests awareness and intentionality. The hive mind demonstrates creativity in its solutions to tactical challenges, producing novel organisms and strategies rather than simply repeating successful patterns. This innovative capacity implies something beyond mechanical response to stimuli, suggesting a consciousness that can imagine possibilities and deliberately choose between alternatives. The hive mind's apparent recognition of different threat levels provides additional evidence for conscious intelligence. Tyranid forces adjust their response based on the strength of opposition they encounter, deploying appropriate levels of force rather than simply overwhelming every target with maximum available resources. A lightly defended agri-world receives a smaller invasion force than a fortress world, suggesting the hive mind calculates resource allocation based on expected resistance. This discrimination indicates assessment and decision-making processes that go beyond simple stimulus-response behavior. The relationship between the hive mind and individual Tyranid organisms raises philosophical questions about the nature of identity and consciousness. Each organism exists as both an independent biological entity and a component of the greater whole, possessing no individual awareness, yet contributing to a collective consciousness of staggering magnitude. The creatures experience sensory input. They see, hear, and feel their environments, but these sensations flow directly into the hive mind rather than being processed by individual awareness. A hormigaunt charging an enemy position does not experience fear or excitement. It simply executes the hive mind's will, its body responding to commands that originate from the collective consciousness rather than individual thought. This complete absence of self-preservation instinct makes Tyranid organisms fundamentally different from other species. Humans, orcs, and even most Xenos species demonstrate concern for their own survival, this instinct influencing their behavior and limiting their willingness to accept casualties. The Tyranids possess no such limitation. Individual organisms are completely expendable from the hive mind's perspective, their deaths mattering only insofar as they represent lost biomass and reduced combat capability. This allows tactical approaches that would be impossible for species where individuals value their own survival, suicide attacks, using organisms as living shields, and accepting catastrophic casualties to achieve objectives all become viable strategies when the combatants possess no survival instinct. The absence of individual consciousness also eliminates psychological warfare as an effective tool against Tyranid forces. Tactics that rely on breaking enemy morale, creating fear, or exploiting hesitation prove useless against organisms that cannot experience these states. Tyranid swarms advance into withering fire without slowing, their organisms dying by the hundreds without affecting the determination of those behind them. They cannot be intimidated, demoralized, or convinced to retreat through displays of force. The only way to stop a Tyranid advance is to kill every organism or disrupt the synaptic network that coordinates them, psychological pressure having no effect whatsoever on creatures that possess no psychology in any recognizable sense. The hive mind's learning process operates on timescales that make it particularly dangerous to long-term Imperial defensive strategies. Every engagement provides data that the collective consciousness analyzes and incorporates into its tactical database. Weapons that prove effective in one battle become less effective in subsequent encounters as the hive mind produces organisms with enhanced resistance to those specific threats. Defensive strategies that successfully repel initial assaults fail against adapted follow-up attacks that account for the tactics that worked previously. This continuous improvement means that the Tyranids become progressively more difficult to fight, each victory against them providing information that makes future victories less likely. The speed of this adaptation varies based on the complexity of the threat and the genetic resources available to the hive mind. Simple adaptations like enhanced carapace thickness or heat-resistant structures can appear within days or weeks, the hive mind producing modified organisms from existing genetic templates. More sophisticated adaptations requiring novel biological solutions take longer, sometimes months, as the hive mind experiments with different genetic combinations to produce organisms optimized for specific challenges. However, even these longer adaptation cycles operate faster than Imperial military procurement and doctrine development, creating situations where the Tyranids evolve countermeasures faster than the Imperium can deploy new weapons or tactics. The purpose driving the hive mind's endless consumption remains one of the greatest mysteries surrounding the Tyranid species. The creatures consume entire worlds, converting all biomass into additional Tyranid organisms, but to what end remains unclear. If the hive mind possesses consciousness and purpose, what does it ultimately seek to achieve? The most straightforward interpretation suggests simple survival and reproduction, the Tyranids following biological imperatives to consume and multiply without any goal beyond continued existence. This explanation treats them as a natural force, a species following evolutionary programming that has proven successful across millions of years. Alternative theories propose more disturbing possibilities. Some xenobiologists suggest the Tyranids are preparing for something, their consumption of galaxies serving as resource gathering for some future purpose that human observers cannot comprehend. The construction projects like the Norn Crown on Xyophoria hint at objectives beyond simple consumption, suggesting the hive mind pursues goals that extend beyond immediate biomass acquisition. If the Tyranids are building something or preparing for some event, the implications for the galaxy's future become even more catastrophic than the immediate threat of consumption. The possibility that the hive mind experiences something analogous to satisfaction or fulfillment when consuming biomass remains purely speculative, but cannot be entirely dismissed. If the collective consciousness does experience states that could be called emotional, then the endless consumption might serve purposes beyond simple resource acquisition. The hive mind might derive something from the act of consumption itself, making the process the goal rather than a means to an end. This interpretation would make the Tyranids not just a threat to physical survival, but to the fundamental meaning of existence, a force that finds purpose in the annihilation of all other life. The Imperium's response to the Tyranid threat has evolved through centuries of bitter experience, each encounter with the Hive Fleets forcing adaptation of military doctrine and the development of specialized tactics that differ fundamentally from conventional warfare. The realization that the Tyranids represent an existential threat rather than another Xeno species to be contained has prompted the deployment of resources and expertise from multiple Imperial organizations, each contributing their specialized capabilities to the broader struggle for survival. The coordination challenges inherent in the Imperium's bureaucratic structure complicate these efforts, but the sheer magnitude of the Tyranid threat has occasionally forced unprecedented cooperation between institutions that normally operate with jealous independence. The Death Watch stands as the Imperium's premier anti-Xenos force, space marines drawn from chapters across the galaxy and trained specifically for Xenocide operations. These warriors operate in kill teams that combine expertise from different chapters, their varied combat doctrines, and specialized knowledge creating tactical flexibility that conventional space marine forces cannot match. Each battle brother brings the traditions and techniques of his parent chapter, while learning to integrate with warriors from different genetic lineages and combat philosophies. This cross-pollination of tactical approaches proves particularly valuable when fighting Tyranids, whose adaptive capabilities render single-approach strategies increasingly ineffective over time. Deathwatch protocols for engaging Tyranid forces emphasize the disruption of synaptic networks as the primary tactical objective. Kill teams receive extensive training in identifying synapse creatures within Tyranid swarms, learning to recognize the behavioral patterns that indicate command organisms, and understanding the visual distinctions that separate warriors and hive tyrants from lesser bioforms. The standard Deathwatch approach involves precision strikes against these synapse creatures, eliminating them in rapid succession to create gaps in the hive mind's control network. This requires exceptional marksmanship and tactical coordination, as synapse creatures typically position themselves within protective screens of lesser organisms and often possess defensive capabilities that make them difficult to kill even when targeted successfully. The specialized ammunition that Deathwatch kill teams employ reflects centuries of accumulated knowledge about Tyranid vulnerabilities. Hellfire rounds contain mutagenic acids specifically designed to break down Tyranid chitin and disrupt their cellular structure. These specialized bolter shells proving significantly more effective against Tyranid organisms than standard mass reactive ammunition. Kraken penetrator rounds provide enhanced armor-piercing capabilities necessary for engaging heavily armored bioforms like carnifexes. Their dense metal cores, capable of punching through chitinous plates that deflect conventional rounds. Dragonfire bolts incorporate chemical payloads that continue burning after impact, preventing the rapid regeneration that allows some Tyranid organisms to recover from wounds that would kill other creatures. The tactical doctrine that Deathwatch kill teams follow when engaging Tyranid swarms differs substantially from standard Space Marine combat procedures. Rather than holding defensive positions or conducting frontal assaults, Deathwatch teams operate as mobile strike forces that infiltrate Tyranid-controlled territory to eliminate high-value targets. A typical operation involves insertion behind Tyranid lines through drop pod assault or teleportation, rapid movement to locate synapse creatures through enhanced auspex scanning and visual reconnaissance, elimination of priority targets through coordinated fire, and immediate extraction before the disorganized swarm can re-establish coordination. The speed and precision required for these operations demand warriors of exceptional capability, and Deathwatch recruitment standards ensure that only the most skilled battle brothers from each chapter receive assignment to the organization. The specialized training that Deathwatch members receive includes extensive study of Tyranid biology and behavior patterns. Battle brothers learn to identify weak points in various bioform anatomies, understanding where to place shots for maximum effect against different organism types. They study recordings of previous Tyranid engagements, analyzing swarm tactics and identifying patterns that indicate specific bioform deployments. The training emphasizes rapid threat assessment, teaching warriors to evaluate Tyranid forces and identify the most dangerous organisms within seconds of contact. This knowledge base grows continuously as the Deathwatch accumulates intelligence from ongoing operations across the galaxy, each engagement contributing data that refines understanding of Tyranid capabilities and vulnerabilities. The watch fortresses that serve as Deathwatch operational bases maintain extensive xenobiological research facilities where captured Tyranid specimens undergo analysis. These laboratories represent some of the most dangerous locations in the Imperium, housing living Tyranid organisms in containment systems designed to prevent escape while allowing detailed study. The research conducted in these facilities provides crucial intelligence on Tyranid adaptation mechanisms, genetic structures, and the biological processes that enable their rapid evolution. However, the risks inherent in maintaining living Tyranid specimens cannot be overstated. Multiple incidents have occurred where containment failures resulted in watch fortresses becoming infested, requiring complete sterilization and the loss of valuable research data, along with the lives of battle brothers and support personnel. The Ordo Xenos of the Imperial Inquisition approaches the Tyranid threat from a strategic perspective that complements the Deathwatch's tactical operations. Inquisitors assigned to monitor Tyranid activity coordinate intelligence, gathering across multiple sectors, tracking Hive Fleet movements, and attempting to predict their trajectories. This work requires synthesizing information from diverse sources, including astropathic reports, explorator fleet observations, and survivor testimonies from worlds that have experienced Tyranid attacks. The fragmentary nature of this intelligence, complicated by the shadow in the warp disrupting communications in affected regions, makes accurate threat assessment extremely difficult. Inquisitors must often make critical decisions based on incomplete information, their choices determining which worlds receive reinforcement and which are abandoned to their fate. The quarantine procedures that the Ordo Xenos implements when Tyranid infiltration is suspected reflect the understanding that genestealer cults represent threats as dangerous as conventional military invasion. Inquisitors investigating potential cult activity face populations where any individual might be a hybrid, their human appearance concealing Tyranid genetic corruption. The standard response involves comprehensive genetic screening of suspected populations, a process that requires substantial resources and time that may not be available when Hive Fleets approach. The discovery of established cult presence typically prompts immediate escalation to full planetary quarantine, all traffic in and out of the system being halted to prevent cult members from spreading to other worlds. This quarantine often comes too late, cult members having already infiltrated merchant vessels and departed the system before their presence was detected. The decision calculus surrounding exterminatus when facing Tyranid infestation represents one of the most difficult choices Inquisitors must make. The complete destruction of a world through orbital bombardment or cyclonic torpedoes eliminates both the Tyranid presence and the biomass they seek to consume, denying the Hive Fleet resources that would fuel further expansion. However, this solution requires accepting the deaths of any remaining Imperial citizens on the world and the permanent loss of whatever economic or strategic value the planet possessed. Inquisitors must weigh these costs against the alternative of allowing the Tyranids to consume the world and grow stronger, potentially enabling them to threat additional systems that might otherwise remain safe. The criteria that guide exterminatus decisions have evolved as Imperial understanding of Tyranid consumption patterns has improved. Early in the Tyranid Wars, some Inquisitors hesitated to authorize planetary destruction, believing that conventional military responses might still save worlds even after Tyranid forces had established substantial presence. Experience has demonstrated that once Tyranid consumption enters advanced stages, with capillary towers established and Ripper swarms deployed across significant portions of the planetary surface, reclaiming the world becomes effectively impossible with available Imperial resources. Current Ordo Zeno's doctrine recommends exterminatus authorization when Tyranid forces control more than 30% of a world's surface and have begun atmospheric conversion, the calculation being that the biomass already lost to the Tyranids justifies destroying the remainder rather than allowing them to complete the harvest. The political complications surrounding exterminatus decisions create additional difficulties for Inquisitors attempting to respond to Tyranid threats. Planetary governors resist accepting that their worlds are lost, their pleas for continued defense and promises of imminent victory influencing sector command decisions, even when objective analysis suggests evacuation or destruction, represents the only viable option. The Administratum's concern with maintaining production quotas and tax revenues creates institutional pressure against abandoning worlds even when their strategic value has become negative due to Tyranid infestation. Inquisitors must sometimes override local authority and ignore sector command preferences to implement exterminatus, their authority deriving directly from the Emperor, providing legal justification for decisions that would otherwise constitute treason. The Adeptus Mechanicus contribution to anti-Tyranid warfare centers on biological research, aimed at identifying exploitable weaknesses in Tyranid physiology and developing weapons specifically designed to counter their adaptive capabilities. The Magos biologists who conduct this research operate under conditions of extreme risk, their work requiring direct interaction with Tyranid genetic material and sometimes living specimens. The containment protocols these tech priests implement reflect hard-won understanding of Tyranid infiltration capabilities, with multiple redundant security systems designed to prevent escape of organisms being studied and to detect any genetic contamination of research personnel. The biological weapons programs that various Forge worlds have pursued represent attempts to turn the Tyranids' own adaptive mechanisms against them. Engineered viruses designed to target Tyranid genetic sequences show initial promise in laboratory conditions, these pathogens breaking down chitinous structures or disrupting the synaptic connections that enable hive mind control. However, field deployment of these bioweapons has yielded disappointing results, the hive mind's rapid adaptation typically producing resistant organisms within days of initial exposure. Some viral agents that successfully killed first-generation Tyranid organisms prove completely ineffective against subsequent waves, the creatures having incorporated genetic defenses that neutralize the pathogen. More concerning, several incidents have occurred where Tyranid organisms absorbed the bioweapons deployed against them and integrated modified versions into their own arsenals, the hive mind reverse engineering Imperial biological warfare agents and producing organisms that deploy similar weapons against human targets. The toxin research conducted by Forge Worlds specializing in chemical warfare has produced compounds that prove more reliably effective than biological agents, though these too face adaptation challenges. Nerve agents designed to disrupt synaptic function can incapacitate Tyranid organisms, though the creature's redundant nervous systems often allow them to continue functioning despite exposure to toxins that would kill humans instantly. Corrosive compounds that dissolve chitin show effectiveness against lighter Tyranid bioforms, but struggle to penetrate the armor of larger organisms. The most successful toxins combine multiple mechanisms of action, attacking Tyranid physiology through several pathways simultaneously to complicate the adaptation process. However, producing these complex compounds in quantities sufficient for military deployment requires substantial industrial capacity, and the hive mind's eventual adaptation to even multi-vector toxins limits their operational lifespan. The extreme risks associated with studying living Tyranid specimens have been demonstrated through numerous catastrophic incidents where containment failures resulted in facility-wide infestation. The most infamous case occurred on the Forge world of Griffon 4, where Magos Biologi's researchers, maintaining a collection of Tyranid organisms for study, failed to account for the creature's ability to communicate through psychic means, even when physically isolated. The specimens coordinated an escape attempt that overwhelmed security forces and resulted in a full-scale Tyranid outbreak within the Forge world's research complex. The infestation spread through the facility's ventilation systems and service tunnels, gene stealers and lictors that had been held in separate containment areas working together to breach additional security zones and release other specimens. The Mechanicus eventually contained the outbreak through the complete destruction of the research complex and the surrounding industrial sectors, but not before losing decades of accumulated research data and several hundred tech priests and Skidari defenders. The lessons learned from containment failures have led to increasingly stringent protocols for Tyranid specimen research. Current Mechanicus doctrine requires that any facility housing living Tyranid organisms maintain multiple redundant containment systems, with each layer designed to function independently and to fail in ways that trigger automatic sterilization of compromised areas. Research personnel must undergo genetic screening before and after each interaction with Tyranid materials to detect any contamination or gene stealer infection. The facilities themselves are typically constructed on isolated moons or asteroid bases, where complete destruction can be accomplished without threatening major population centers, and standing orders authorize immediate exterminatus if containment appears likely to fail completely. The strategic doctrines that Imperial military forces employ when facing Tyranid invasions emphasize denial of biomass as the fundamental principle underlying all tactical decisions. This approach recognizes that conventional victory conditions, destroying enemy forces and holding territory, prove counterproductive when fighting organisms that convert casualties into additional resources. Imperial commanders must instead focus on preventing the Tyranids from accessing biomass, while evacuating or destroying resources that cannot be defended. This requires accepting the loss of territory and populations that conventional military doctrine would prioritize defending, a shift in thinking that many Imperial Guard officers trained in traditional warfare struggle to internalize. The scorched earth tactics that this strategic approach necessitates involve systematic destruction of anything the Tyranids might consume. Agricultural products are burned in the fields rather than harvested. Livestock herds are slaughtered and cremated rather than allowed to fall into Tyranid hands. Forests are set ablaze to deny the biomass they contain. Water treatment facilities are sabotaged to prevent the Tyranids from accessing processed water supplies. The human cost of these measures extends beyond simple casualties, as populations that might have been evacuated are sometimes denied rescue to prevent their biomass from strengthening the Tyranid swarm. These decisions represent calculations that reduce human lives to resource values, a utilitarian mathematics that conflicts with the Imperium's nominal concern for its citizens, but which strategic necessity demands. The importance of void superiority when fighting Tyranid invasions cannot be overstated, as control of orbital space determines whether the enemy can land forces and establish the infrastructure necessary for planetary consumption. Imperial naval doctrine for engaging Tyranid bioships emphasizes destroying Hive ships and other large organisms that serve as mobile factories for producing ground forces. The standard approach involves concentrated fire from multiple vessels targeting individual Hive ships, accepting that the bioship escorts will inflict damage on the Imperial fleet, while the capital ships focus on eliminating the primary threat. This strategy requires discipline from Imperial captains accustomed to engaging the most immediate threats rather than accepting damage to achieve strategic objectives. The unique challenges of void combat against Tyranid bioships force adaptations of standard Imperial naval tactics. The creature's ability to regenerate damage between engagements means that wounded bioships that escape may return to subsequent battles at full effectiveness, making complete destruction of targeted vessels essential. The boarding organisms that bioships deploy create internal threats that conventional naval combat does not involve, requiring Imperial vessels to maintain substantial security forces capable of repelling genestealers and other infiltrator organisms. The spore mines that drift through space around Tyranid fleets function as area denial weapons that force Imperial ships to maneuver constantly, reducing their ability to maintain stable firing positions and degrading targeting accuracy. The coordination challenges that complicate Imperial responses to Tyranid threats stem from the fundamental structure of Imperial governance and military organization. The Imperium's various institutions operate with substantial autonomy, their overlapping jurisdictions and competing priorities creating friction that hampers unified strategic response. The Imperial Guard answers to the Adeptus Munitorum and ultimately the High Lords of Terra, while Space Marine chapters maintain complete operational independence. The Imperial Navy operates under separate command structures from ground forces, and the Adeptus Mechanicus pursues its own objectives that may or may not align with broader Imperial strategy. The Inquisition possesses authority that theoretically supersedes all other institutions, but individual inquisitors often disagree on appropriate responses to specific threats. These institutional divisions create situations where Imperial forces fighting the same Tyranid incursion operate according to different strategic priorities and sometimes work at cross purposes. Space Marine chapters deploy to defend worlds they consider strategically valuable, while Imperial Guard regiments receive orders to hold different positions based on Adeptus Munitorum assessments. The Imperial Navy prioritizes protecting shipping lanes and forge worlds that produce the vessels they depend on, which may not align with ground force requirements for orbital fire support. The Adeptus Mechanicus evacuates tech priests and critical technology from threatened worlds, sometimes utilizing transport capacity that could have carried additional refugees or military supplies. Individual inquisitors pursuing their own investigations commandeer resources without coordinating with local military command, their actions disrupting carefully planned operations. The communication difficulties created by the shadow and the warp exacerbate these coordination problems, as the psychic interference prevents effective astropathic communication between forces operating in different systems. Imperial commanders lose contact with higher headquarters and must make decisions based on outdated intelligence or pure speculation about the broader strategic situation. Reinforcement requests go unanswered, not because they have been denied, but because they never reach their intended recipients. Forces dispatched to aid besieged worlds arrive to find situations completely different from what their orders anticipated, the delay between message transmission and receipt allowing circumstances to change dramatically. The isolation that the shadow creates forces each threatened system to fight largely independently, the Imperium's normal advantages in strategic coordination and resource allocation being negated by the Hive mind's psychic presence. The resource allocation decisions that sector commanders must make when multiple worlds face simultaneous Tyranid assault represent impossible choices between bad options. Available Space Marine forces, Imperial Guard regiments, and naval assets cannot defend all threatened positions simultaneously, forcing commanders to prioritize some worlds over others. The criteria for these decisions theoretically involve strategic value assessments, forge worlds and hive worlds receiving priority over agri-worlds and mining colonies due to their greater economic and military importance. However, political considerations, personal relationships, and institutional biases influence these supposedly objective calculations. Worlds with strong connections to influential noble houses or administratum officials receive reinforcement that strategic analysis might not justify, while isolated systems with limited political influence are abandoned despite their population's desperate pleas for aid. The long-term strategic situation regarding the Tyranid threat continues deteriorating despite localized Imperial victories and successful defensive actions. Each Hive fleet defeated or scattered represents a temporary reprieve rather than permanent solution, as new tendrils continue emerging from the intergalactic void and splinter fleets from previous invasions remain active throughout the galaxy. The biomass calculations performed by Adeptus Mechanicus analysts suggest that the Tyranids have already consumed resources equivalent to thousands of Imperial worlds. This material converted into additional bioships and organisms that fuel continued expansion. The rate of Tyranid growth exceeds the Imperium's capacity to replace losses, creating an attrition dynamic that favors the invaders over any extended timeframe. The adaptation of Imperial military doctrine to account for Tyranid capabilities remains incomplete across much of the Imperium's military establishment. Many Imperial Guard regiments continue training and equipping for conventional warfare against human or orc opponents, their doctrine emphasizing tactics that prove counterproductive when fighting Tyranids. The procurement systems that supply Imperial forces operate on timescales measured in years or decades, far too slow to respond to the rapid evolution of Tyranid threats. Specialized anti-Tyranid equipment like Hellfire rounds and toxin dispensers remain available only to elite forces like the Death Watch, standard Imperial Guard units making do with conventional weapons that show decreasing effectiveness as the hive mind adapts to counter them. The institutional inertia inherent in the Imperium's bureaucratic structures prevents rapid dissemination of tactical innovations, successful techniques developed by forces in one sector taking decades to reach units operating in other regions. The psychological toll that extended campaigns against Tyranid forces inflict on Imperial military personnel represents a challenge that conventional military training does not adequately address. Soldiers who survive battles against the Tyranids often experience trauma that differs from what combat against other enemies produces, the alien nature of the hive mind, and the complete absence of familiar psychological dynamics creating stress that breaks even veteran warriors. The understanding that the enemy feels no fear, accepts any casualties, and will inevitably adapt to counter successful tactics creates a sense of futility that erodes morale over time. Units that have fought multiple engagements against Tyranid forces show increased rates of desertion, psychological breakdown, and loss of combat effectiveness even when they achieve tactical victories. The strategic assessments conducted by the Imperium's most learned minds paint a picture of existential dread that grows darker with each passing year. The Magos biologies of the Adeptus Mechanicus, working from data accumulated across centuries of Tyranid encounters, have performed calculations regarding the scale of the threat that suggest conclusions almost too terrible to accept. Their models, based on observed hive fleet biomass concentrations and consumption rates, indicate that the forces which have already entered the galaxy represent merely the vanguard elements of an incomprehensibly larger swarm. The bioships and organisms that Imperial forces have encountered and cataloged, numbering in the trillions across all known hive fleets and splinter forces, may constitute less than 1% of the total Tyranid presence approaching from the intergalactic void. These calculations rest on multiple data points that, when synthesized, suggest a threat of galactic extinction magnitude. The trajectory analysis of major hive fleets indicates they originated from regions of intergalactic space where no significant gravitational masses exist to slow their approach. The velocities at which these fleets traveled, combined with estimates of journey duration, based on biological degradation of recovered specimens, suggest departure from the nearest galaxy millions of years ago. If the Tyranids consumed that entire galaxy before beginning their journey to the Milky Way, as some xenobiologists theorize, then the biomass they accumulated would dwarf anything humanity can comprehend. A galaxy worth of consumed biological matter, converted entirely into Tyranid organisms and bioships, would create a swarm large enough to overwhelm any conceivable defense the Imperium could mount. The forward elements that have already engaged Imperial forces demonstrate capabilities that support these dire projections. Hive Fleet Leviathan alone possessed sufficient biomass to threaten multiple sectors simultaneously, its tendrils operating independently while maintaining coordination that suggested connection to a vastly larger consciousness. The fact that Leviathan continues advancing despite suffering losses that would have annihilated Behemoth or scattered Kraken indicates access to resources that allow it to absorb catastrophic casualties and continue operations without meaningful degradation of combat effectiveness. If Leviathan represents a major tendril rather than a splinter fleet, and if multiple tendrils of similar or greater size remain in the intergalactic void, then the forces the Imperium has fought represent preliminary reconnaissance rather than the main invasion. The Adeptus Mechanicus calculations account for the biomass that observed Hive fleets have already consumed within the galaxy, this material being converted into additional Tyranid forces that strengthen subsequent waves. Every world that falls adds to the swarm's strength, creating a feedback loop where success breeds exponential growth. The mathematical models project that if current consumption rates continue, the Tyranids will achieve sufficient biomass concentration within several centuries to overwhelm the Imperium's defensive capabilities, regardless of tactical innovations or strategic redeployments. The timeline extends or contracts based on variables including the rate at which new Hive fleet elements enter the galaxy, the effectiveness of Imperial defensive actions, and whether the Tyranids encounter significant resistance from other galactic powers like the Orcs or Eldari. Some Magos Biologists researchers have proposed even more pessimistic scenarios based on observations of Tyranid adaptation rates and genetic diversity. The speed at which the hive mind incorporates new biological traits and the sophistication of organisms it produces suggest a genetic library accumulated over millions of years of consuming diverse species. If the Tyranids have been moving between galaxies for geological timescales, consuming each in turn before moving to the next, then they have had opportunities to encounter and catalog biological innovations from thousands or millions of different evolutionary lineages. This accumulated genetic knowledge would make them effectively impossible to counter through biological or chemical warfare, as any toxin or pathogen humanity develops would likely match something the hive mind has already encountered and developed resistance to during previous galactic consumptions. The Octarius War represents both a potential containment strategy and a catastrophic miscalculation whose full implications continue unfolding. Inquisitor Kryptman's decision to redirect a Tyranid splinter fleet toward the Orc Empire in the Octarius sector was born from desperate strategic calculation. Faced with Hive Fleet Leviathan's advance, and recognizing that the Imperium lacked sufficient forces to halt it through conventional military action, Kryptman theorized that the two most dangerous Xenos threats in the galaxy might destroy each other if brought into conflict. The Orcs of Octarius represented one of the largest greenskin concentrations outside of major Wa movements, their numbers sufficient to pose serious threats to Imperial worlds throughout the region. By directing Tyranid forces toward this concentration, Kryptman hoped to create a war of attrition that would weaken both species. The initial phases of the Octarius conflict appeared to validate Kryptman's strategy. The Tyranids and Orcs engaged in battles of staggering scale, both sides suffering casualties that would have crippled conventional military forces. The Orcs responded to the Tyranid invasion with characteristic enthusiasm, viewing the endless waves of alien organisms as the greatest fight their civilization had encountered in generations. The Greenskins mobilized their entire society for war, every clan contributing warriors to armies that met the Tyranid swarms in battles that consumed entire worlds. The Tyranids consumed orc biomass and converted it into additional organisms, while the orc spores ensured that even consumed greenskins would eventually produce new orcs from the soil where they died. However, the long-term consequences of this conflict have proven far more complex and dangerous than Kryptman anticipated. Rather than weakening both sides through mutual attrition, the constant warfare has strengthened them in ways that threaten to create threats worse than either species represented individually. The orcs grow larger and more aggressive through continuous combat, their biology responding to the endless fighting by producing bigger and more dangerous individuals. The warbosses emerging from the Octarius conflict possess size and strength that rival the legendary greenskin leaders of the Great Crusade era, their experience fighting Tyranids making them tactically sophisticated in ways that orcs rarely demonstrate. These super orcs represent potential future threats to Imperial worlds throughout the Eastern Fringe, their combat capabilities enhanced by generations of warfare against enemies that force them to evolve or die. The Tyranids have adapted with equal speed to counter orc tactics and biology. The organisms emerging from the Octarius conflict demonstrate specific optimizations for fighting greenskins, including enhanced resistance to orc weapons, biological countermeasures against orc spores, and behavioral patterns that account for greenskin combat psychology. More concerning, the hive mind has incorporated orc genetic material into its library, gaining access to biological traits that make Tyranid organisms more resilient and aggressive. Some xenobiologists fear that the Tyranids are learning to replicate the orcs' most dangerous characteristic, their ability to thrive in warfare and grow stronger through conflict rather than being weakened by it. If the hive mind successfully integrates this trait into its organisms, the resulting bioforms would represent threats that grow more dangerous the longer they fight, rather than being worn down through attrition. The geographic spread of the Octarius conflict has expanded beyond the original sector boundaries, as elements of both forces spill into neighboring regions. Orc warbands that fought in Octarius have departed the sector seeking new fights, their enhanced size and combat experience making them dangerous to worlds that would have successfully repelled normal orc incursions. Tyranid splinter fleets that fed on the abundant biomass in Octarius have grown large enough to threaten systems that previously faced no Tyranid presence. Rather than containing two threats in a single location, Kryptman's strategy has created a spreading zone of conflict that exports enhanced versions of both species to previously secure regions. The Imperium now faces the prospect of fighting orcs that have been strengthened through combat with Tyranids and Tyranids that have adapted specifically to counter one of the galaxy's most resilient species. The Inquisition's response to Kryptman's actions reflects the controversy surrounding his strategy. Some within the Ordo Xenos praise his willingness to make difficult decisions and implement unconventional solutions to existential threats, viewing the Octarius Gambit as a necessary risk given the alternatives available. Others condemn him for creating a situation that may ultimately prove worse than the original problem, arguing that deliberate manipulation of Xenos forces represents dangerous hubris that assumes humans can predict and control outcomes involving species that operate according to fundamentally alien logic. Kryptman himself has been declared excommunicate traitoris, his actions deemed too radical even by inquisitorial standards. He continues operating independently, pursuing his own strategies for combating the Tyranid threat without official sanction or support. The theoretical frameworks that various Imperial scholars have proposed to explain Tyranid behavior and ultimate objectives range from the mundane to the apocalyptic. The simplest explanation treats the Tyranids as a purely biological phenomenon, a species following evolutionary imperatives to consume and reproduce, without any purpose beyond continued existence. This interpretation views the hive mind as sophisticated but ultimately mechanical, its intelligence being directed entirely toward resource acquisition and survival, rather than pursuing any abstract goals. The Tyranids consume galaxies, because that is what their biology compels them to do, much as humans breathe air or plants grow toward light. This explanation requires no assumption of conscious purpose or long-term planning beyond the immediate objectives of finding biomass and converting it into more Tyranids. Alternative theories propose that the Tyranids are fleeing from something even more dangerous than themselves, their consumption of galaxies, representing desperate resource gathering in preparation for some future threat or conflict. This hypothesis attempts to explain the urgency with which the Hive Fleets advance and the single-minded focus on biomass acquisition that characterizes their operations. If the Tyranids encountered something in the intergalactic void, or in previous galaxies they consumed that forced them to flee, then their behavior might represent preparation for eventual confrontation with this unknown enemy. The implications of this theory prove even more disturbing than the straightforward interpretation, as any threat capable of forcing the Tyranids to flee would represent a danger that dwarfs even the great devourer itself. Some radical xenobiologists within the Adeptus Mechanicus have proposed that the Tyranids are following a beacon, their approach to the Milky Way being guided by some signal that draws them toward the galaxy. The Astronomicon represents the most obvious candidate for such a beacon, the psychic light that guides Imperial navigation being powerful enough to be detected across vast distances. If the hive mind perceives the Astronomicon as a concentration of psychic energy or as an indicator of abundant life, then humanity's greatest navigational achievement may have inadvertently served as a dinner bell summoning the Tyranids to the galaxy. This theory suggests that the Imperium itself bears partial responsibility for the Tyranid invasion, the Emperor's creation of the Astronomicon having attracted the attention of the greatest threat humanity has ever faced. The possibility that the Tyranids are drawn to the Astronomicon has prompted debates within the highest levels of Imperial command about whether the beacon should be dimmed or redirected to lead Hive Fleets away from Terra and other critical worlds. However, the practical impossibility of such actions, the Astronomicon being essential for warp navigation throughout the Imperium, means that these remain theoretical discussions rather than actionable strategies. Even if the Imperium possessed the capability to alter the Astronomicon's function, doing so would cripple interstellar travel and communication throughout human space, potentially causing more damage than the Tyranid threat itself. The Imperium finds itself trapped by its own infrastructure, unable to remove the potential beacon without destroying the systems that allow human civilization to function across galactic distances. Other scholars propose that the Tyranids are following evolutionary imperatives that operate on timescales and according to logic that human minds struggle to comprehend. The hive mind might be pursuing objectives that will only become apparent after millions of years of operation, its current consumption of the Milky Way representing a single step in a process that spans geological ages. This interpretation suggests that attempting to understand Tyranid purpose using human frameworks of motivation and goal-directed behavior fundamentally misunderstands the nature of the threat. The Tyranids might be following biological programming that emerged from evolutionary pressures in environments utterly unlike anything humanity has experienced, their actions making perfect sense according to alien logic that humans cannot access or comprehend. The existential threat assessment that various Imperial institutions have conducted regarding the Tyranids reflects growing consensus that they represent the ultimate extinction event for the galaxy. The scholarly debates within the Ordo Xenos, the Adeptus Mechanicus, and even elements of the ecclesiarchy increasingly focus on whether the Tyranids pose a greater threat to human survival than chaos itself. The comparison proves difficult because the two threats operate according to fundamentally different principles and threaten humanity in distinct ways. Chaos corrupts and transforms, turning humans against themselves and perverting the Imperium's institutions from within. The Tyranids simply consume, eliminating all life and converting it into more of themselves without corruption or transformation. The arguments favoring chaos as the greater threat emphasize its immortal nature and its fundamental connection to human psychology. The chaos gods cannot be destroyed through conventional means, their existence being sustained by the emotions and thoughts of sentient beings throughout the galaxy. Even if humanity somehow defeated every demon and chaos space marine in existence, the ruinous powers would persist as long as humans experience the emotions that feed them. The corruption that chaos spreads proves insidious and difficult to detect, with entire worlds falling to worship of the dark gods before Imperial authorities recognize the problem. The mutations and madness that chaos inflicts create suffering that extends beyond simple death, transforming victims into things that would have horrified their former selves. The counterarguments supporting the assessment that Tyranids represent the ultimate threat focus on their capacity for complete extinction and their immunity to the tactics that can be used against other enemies. Chaos can be fought through faith, through the purging of corruption, and through the sacrifice of psychers who hold back the tides of the warp. The Tyranids cannot be reasoned with, converted, or turned against themselves. They possess no ideology to subvert, no internal conflicts to exploit, and no desires that can be manipulated. Every tactic that has proven effective against chaos, martyrdom that inspires others, corruption of enemy forces, exploitation of rivalries between the chaos gods, proves useless against organisms that possess no individual consciousness and pursue only the consumption of biomass. The mathematical inevitability of Tyranid victory in any extended conflict provides the strongest argument for classifying them as the ultimate threat. The hive mind learns from every engagement, adapting to counter successful defensive strategies faster than the Imperium can develop new ones. The biomass feedback loop ensures that Tyranid forces grow stronger with each world they consume, while Imperial strength diminishes with each loss. The shadow in the warp prevents the coordination and reinforcement that conventional military doctrine relies upon, isolating defenders and preventing unified strategic response. Given sufficient time, these factors combine to create a situation where Tyranid victory becomes mathematically certain regardless of tactical innovations or heroic sacrifices. The resource calculations that support this grim assessment account for the Imperium's finite military capacity and the Tyranids' effectively unlimited growth potential. The Imperium can produce only so many space marines, only so many Imperial Guard regiments, only so many warships before exhausting available resources and industrial capacity. The Tyranids convert every world they consume into additional forces, their bioships serving as mobile factories that can produce millions of organisms from captured biomass. The rate of Tyranid expansion exceeds the Imperium's replacement capacity, creating an attrition dynamic where humanity loses ground even when achieving tactical victories. Unless some fundamental change occurs in the strategic situation, the discovery of a universal Tyranid vulnerability, the intervention of other galactic powers, or some catastrophic event that disrupts Hive Fleet operations, the mathematical models project eventual human extinction within several millennia at current consumption rates. Some scholars within the Imperium have proposed that the Tyranids represent a form of galactic immune response, organisms that emerge to consume civilizations that have grown too large or too advanced. This theory, considered heretical by most Imperial authorities due to its implications about the Emperor's plan for humanity, suggests that the Tyranids serve a natural function in the galaxy's life cycle. Just as human immune systems eliminate infections that threaten the body's health, the Tyranids might eliminate civilizations that threaten the galaxy's stability or balance. The fact that they appear to target concentrations of psychically active life, following the astronomican and specifically hunting psychers, supports this interpretation, suggesting they respond to civilizations that have developed sufficient psychic capability to threaten the barrier between real space and the warp. The possibility that humanity's own psychic evolution has attracted the Tyranids creates theological and philosophical problems that the ecclesiarchy struggles to address. If the Emperor's plan to guide humanity towards psychic ascension has inadvertently summoned the Great Devourer, then the future he envisioned for his species may be impossible to achieve. The Imperium finds itself caught between the necessity of maintaining the astronomican, which requires the psychic power of the Emperor, and the sacrifice of thousands of psychers daily, and the possibility that this same beacon draws ever more Tyranid forces toward Terra. The choice between abandoning humanity's greatest navigational tool and continuing to potentially attract the ultimate extinction threat represents an impossible dilemma that current Imperial leadership lacks the wisdom or authority to resolve. The long-term strategic outlook regarding the Tyranid threat grows darker with each passing year as new Hive Fleet elements continue entering the galaxy and existing forces adapt to counter Imperial defensive innovations. The splinter fleets from Kraken remain active throughout the eastern fringe, each pursuing independent consumption of whatever worlds they encounter. Leviathan's tendrils continue advancing from multiple directions, their coordination suggesting connection to an intelligence that operates across galactic distances. New Hive Fleets continue being detected, each designated with names from ancient Terran mythology as Imperial authorities struggle to track the proliferation of threats. The cumulative effect creates a situation where no region of the galaxy remains truly safe from Tyranid incursion, the Hive Fleets having spread to the point where they threaten worlds in every segmentum. The Imperium's response to this deteriorating situation has involved increasingly desperate measures that would have been unthinkable during earlier eras of human history. The deployment of exterminatus has become routine when facing established Tyranid presence, entire worlds being destroyed to deny their biomass to the Hive Fleets. The forced evacuation of populations from threatened sectors has created refugee crises that strain the Imperium's capacity to provide even minimal support. The redeployment of military forces from other theaters to counter Tyranid threats has weakened defenses against chaos, orcs, and other xeno species, creating vulnerabilities that these enemies have begun exploiting. The Imperium finds itself engaged in a multi-front war where every resource committed to one threat represents resources unavailable for others, the strategic calculations becoming increasingly impossible as the number and severity of threats continues escalating. The ultimate question facing humanity in the face of the Tyranid threat remains whether survival is possible, or whether the species faces inevitable extinction regardless of how bravely it fights or how many tactical victories it achieves. The hive mind's patient advance, its capacity for adaptation, and the sheer magnitude of forces it can bring to bear suggest a threat that cannot be permanently defeated through conventional military means. The best humanity can hope for may be temporary containment and local victories that buy time for populations to evacuate or for new defensive strategies to be developed. The possibility of ultimate victory, the complete elimination of the Tyranid threat, appears increasingly remote as the scale of the swarm approaching from the intergalactic void becomes clearer. Yet the Imperium endures, as it has endured for 10,000 years against threats that would have destroyed lesser civilizations. The Space Marines continue their eternal war, each chapter contributing what strength it possesses to the defense of humanity. The Imperial Guard holds the line on countless worlds, ordinary men and women standing against horrors that defy comprehension. The Adeptus Mechanicus pursues knowledge that might provide the key to survival. The Inquisition makes the hard choices that others cannot, accepting damnation to preserve what can be saved. The faith of billions sustains the Astronomicon and powers the rituals that keep the Imperium functioning. While humanity endures, hope persists that some solution to the Tyranid threat might yet be found, some weakness discovered or some ally gained that could shift the strategic balance. The great devourer advances, but humanity fights on, and in that defiance lies the only answer the Imperium has ever given to those who would see it destroyed.